You're not lazy. You're not broken. You're not even lost. You're just trapped by thoughts that feel like your own, but were planted long ago. By beliefs that sound like truth, but are really just noise. By patterns so familiar, you no longer notice them. Every day you try harder, read more, push forward, but something invisible keeps pulling you back. What if it isn't the world that's holding you down, but the architecture of your own mind? What if you're not failing? You're following shortcuts, distortions, illusions, mental traps so deeply woven into your perception, you've mistaken them for instinct, for personality, for reality. This isn't about motivation. It's about liberation. One by one, we'll name the traps. We'll expose them, and we'll unhook your mind from the quiet prisons you didn't know you were living in. 100 traps, 100 keys. One journey back to clarity. Let's begin. Level 1, confirmation bias. You think you're being logical, but really, you're just gathering evidence for what you already believe. That's confirmation bias. You have an opinion, and your brain becomes a lawyer, not a scientist. It doesn't seek truth. It seeks validation. You Google something, and you click the result that agrees with you, not the one that challenges you. You hear feedback. You cling to the part that affirms your ego and ignore the part that invites you to grow. You remember when you were right, forget when you were wrong. This trap doesn't just affect opinions. It affects who you become. You think, I'm not creative. So you overlook every spark of originality that contradicts that belief. You think, people always leave. So you notice the goodbyes and blind yourself to those who stayed. Your brain filters reality to match your story. You don't evolve. You reinforce. This is why growth feels impossible, because the proof you seek is shaped by the beliefs you refuse to question. But what if you paused? What if you asked, what am I afraid to find out? What truth have I avoided because it might undo me? Level 2, Dunning-Kruger effect. You think you know, but you don't know how much you don't know. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cruel trick of the mind. The less you know, the more confident you feel, because you don't yet know what there is to be unsure about. It's the beginner who feels like an expert, and the expert who feels like a beginner. It shows up quietly, in the overconfident speaker, in the reckless investor, in the person who mistakes boldness for brilliance. But it also lives in you, in moments when you assume you've seen the whole picture, without knowing there's a whole library behind the door you never opened. This trap doesn't just lead to bad decisions. It leads to arrogance, to blindness, to a refusal to grow. Because why would you keep learning if you already think you've arrived? It's dangerous, but it's also universal. And ironically, the more you do learn, the more aware you become of how vast your ignorance is. That's the paradox. The wiser you become, the more uncertain you feel. Not because you're weaker, but because you've seen how deep the ocean goes. So beware when confidence comes too easily, when your certainty feels too smooth. Ask yourself, what am I missing? Who might know more? Where could I be wrong? Because true growth doesn't shout, I know everything. It whispers, I'm willing to learn. And that humility, that trembling awareness that you don't know at all, is the real beginning of wisdom. Level 3, sunk cost fallacy. You've come this far, so you might as well keep going. Even if it hurts, even if it's wrong, even if staying costs more than leaving. That's the sunk cost fallacy. It's the voice that says, I've already spent too much time. I've already given too much money. I've already invested too much love. So you hold on to a dream that no longer fits, to a job that slowly breaks you, to a relationship that only exists in memory. You keep pouring in more because you've already poured in so much. But here's the truth. The past is gone. You can't get it back. And spending more won't save what's already lost. We think endurance with wisdom. We think quitting is weakness. But sometimes, letting go is the bravest thing you can do. The fallacy convinces you that abandoning something means all your effort was wasted. But the real waste is in continuing what you no longer believe in. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to say, I've given enough. Letting go doesn't mean it was meaningless. It means you've grown enough to know what no longer serves you. Here's your permission to stop, to cut your losses, to leave the table when love, purpose, and peace are no longer being served. Because your worth is not measured by how much pain you can tolerate. It's measured by how deeply you're willing to choose yourself. Level 4, halo effect. They're attractive, so they must be kind. They're confident, so they must be smart. They're successful, so they must be good. That's the halo effect that lets one shining trait blind you to everything else. It begins quietly. You meet someone who looks the part. Polished, articulate, smiling just right. And suddenly, without realizing it, you give them the benefit of the doubt. You trust their opinion. You overlook the red flags, because your mind has already decided. If they shine in all ways, but light can hide shadows. And brilliance in one area doesn't erase flaws in another. The halo effect shows up everywhere. In how we choose leaders, how we judge strangers, how we fall in love too fast. It even shows up inward. You succeed at something and assume you're invincible. You fail once and assume you're a failure everywhere. This trap simplifies the world, but at a cost. It hides complexity. It distorts judgment. It makes us trust too quickly or dismiss too soon. You might follow someone's advice, not because it's wise, but because they dress like someone who should be right. You might ignore someone's truth because they're awkward, quiet, or unpolished. But wisdom wears many faces, and truth doesn't always come dressed in confidence. Here's your invitation. See the full picture. Separate charisma from character, talent from integrity, image from substance. And when you find yourself placing someone on a pedestal, don't forget to look at the ground beneath them, because no one is flawless. And sometimes the brightest glow casts the darkest blind spot. Level 5. Anchoring bias. You see the first number, and everything after bends around it. It's the first impression, the first price tag, the first sentence someone speaks. That's anchoring bias, the mind's habit of latching onto the initial piece of information and letting it distort everything else. You walk into a store. The tag says was $300, now $100. You feel like you're saving, but would you have thought $100 was fair if you hadn't seen the $300 first? You meet someone. They tell you they're successful, and suddenly, every action they take seems like the move of a genius. You hear, he's always difficult. Now you see rudeness in every word, even if he's just quiet. This trap isn't just about money or reputation. It's about how easily the first thing we see becomes the lens through which we see everything else. It anchors you in relationships, in self-image, in fear. Someone once said you weren't good enough, and that became your anchor. You had one bad experience trying something new, and now every opportunity feels risky. Anchoring isn't always malicious, but it's often invisible. It makes you value things incorrectly, judge too quickly, trust too little, or too much. But here's the shift. You can move the anchor. You can question the first story, re-evaluate the price, redefine the label. The first thing you hear doesn't have to be the truth. It's just the first. And truth isn't afraid of second looks. Level 6, stereotype threat. They expect you to fail, so you start to believe it. You walk into a room and feel the weight of invisible eyes, not watching you, but watching a version of you they've already decided exists. That's stereotype threat. It's the internal fear that you'll confirm someone's assumptions. You're the only woman in the meeting, so you speak less, afraid your words will be judged harsher. You are the only person of color in the room, so you overcompensate, or you shrink, or you stay quiet, not because you lack value, but because you fear becoming a statistic in someone else's story. And it works like poison. Not all at once, but drip by drip. It makes you question yourself even when you know you're right. It makes you play small in moments that needed your full voice. You start to perform, not for success, but for survival. Not to express yourself, but to disprove them. But here's the cruel irony. The more you fear proving the stereotype true, the more it interferes with your ability to show who you really are. This trap isn't your fault. It's the residue of a broken system, a culture that pre-labels before it ever listens. But here's the truth. You are not an exception. You are not a representative. You are not here to carry their projections. You are you. And your voice, your intelligence, your presence isn't on trial. So take up space, say the thing, make the move, not to prove them wrong. Level 7, self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect to fail, so you hesitate. You hesitate, and then you fail. Not because it was inevitable, but because you unknowingly helped it happen. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. It begins as a thought, a quiet doubt, a whisper. This probably won't work. You tell yourself, they'll reject me, so you don't study as hard and fall short. You expect distance, so you withdraw and feel abandoned. And just like that, the belief becomes the outcome. But not because it was fate, because it was fed. You shaped it. We all do. We carry stories written by others. Teachers who underestimated us. Parents who labeled us. A past self who made one mistake and never forgot it. We become what we fear. Not because it's true, but because we stop imagining anything else. Here's the secret. The prophecy isn't destiny. It's a suggestion, a prompt, and you have the power to rewrite it. What if you expected success? What if you walked in believing, I belong here. I can figure this out. I deserve peace. Your mind listens to you, even when you lie, even when you shrink, even when you speak through old scars. So speak carefully, because every thought, level 8, loss aversion. You fear losing more than you desire gaining, so you stay in the job that drains you, in the routine that numbs you, in the identity that no longer fits. That's loss aversion. The pain of letting go feels sharper than the joy of moving forward. You'd rather not lose $100 than win $150. You'd rather keep the familiar than risk the unknown holds everything you want. This trap whispers, don't rock the boat. Don't take the chance. Better to protect what you have than risk what you hope for. And slowly, it turns your life into a museum, full of things you no longer love, but can't bring yourself to leave. You hold on to friendships that only exist in memory. You defend beliefs that no longer reflect who you've become. You keep habits because letting them go feels like admitting they once mattered. But not everything you hold deserves to be kept. Not everything that got you here deserves to go with you. Sometimes, the weight you carry is the reason you can't move. Loss aversion tells you letting go is loss. But letting go can also be space, breath, peace, a beginning. The question isn't, what might I lose? The question is, what might I gain if I finally set this down? Because the truth is, you're not afraid of the risk. You're afraid of grieving the version of yourself that chose the wrong thing. Grieve it, honor it, then outgrow it. And remember, not all losses are wounds, some are doors. Level 9, negativity bias. You remember the insult, but not the compliment. You relive the failure, but forget the win. That's negativity bias, the brain's deep-rooted habit of holding on to pain longer than peace. It's not because you're broken. It's because long ago, remembering danger kept you alive. The mind evolved to scan for threat, to notice what went wrong, to replay what hurt, just in case it happens again. But now, you're not running from tigers. You're running from your past, from memories that echo louder than your joy. You could receive 100 compliments, but one rude comment ruins it. You could feel love, but all your mind plays on repeat is the last time it left. This trap doesn't just affect your mood. It shapes your identity. You start to believe you're not good enough. Not because it's true, but because your brain remembers the bad more vividly than the good. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Because if you don't train your attention, it will default to pain. You have to make joy louder. You have to replay the moments you felt seen. Remember the quiet victories. Celebrate the things that didn't break you. Not because life is always light, but because you deserve to live in more than survival. Here's the shift. Gratitude isn't denial. It's rebellion against the bias that tells you only the wounds are worth remembering. So take inventory of your peace. Name the smiles. Write down the healing. Revisit the love. Not to forget what hurt, but to remind yourself you are more. Level 10, planning fallacy. You think it'll take a day. It takes a week. You think you'll finish by Friday. It stretches into next month. That's the planning fallacy. The mind's stubborn belief that things will go smoother, faster, easier than they ever do. You underestimate the time. You forget the setbacks. You miscalculate the effort. And then you blame yourself when reality doesn't match the fantasy. You thought you'd be further along by now, that this would be done, that you'd have changed already. But you didn't account for life, for fatigue, for the human parts of progress. You made a plan, and then reality made a mess of it. This trap doesn't just make you late. It makes you feel like a failure for not meeting a deadline that was never realistic in the first place. You rush into goals with the optimism of a blank calendar. You forget that emotions exist, that distractions happen, that healing is not a straight line. And when it doesn't go according to plan, you question your worth, not the plan. But here's the truth. You are not behind. You are just inside the part of the process the plan forgot to include. The detour, the pause, the part where growth looks like stillness. So make plans, but make room too. For the mess, for the miracle, for the mystery of what's unfolding in its own time. You don't need tighter schedules. You need more grace. Because your timeline is not a finish line. It's a conversation between your effort and your reality. Level 11, Impostor Syndrome. You did the work. You earned the spot. You crossed the finish line, and yet you feel like a fraud. That's imposter syndrome. It doesn't matter how far you've come. There's a voice inside that says, you don't belong here. You got lucky. They're going to find out. So you over-prepare, overwork, overcompensate, trying to outrun a doubt that never had proof to begin with. You scroll through someone else's success and think they have something you don't. More confidence, more clarity, more worthiness. You forget that what you're feeling isn't evidence of inadequacy. It's evidence of awareness. You're afraid not because you're fake, but because you care. Because the more deeply you value something, the more terrifying it becomes to lose it. But here's the quiet truth. You didn't trick your way here. You climbed, you stumbled, you learned, you stayed. You showed up on days you didn't feel enough and did the work anyway. That's not luck, that's character. And just because doubt is present doesn't mean truth is Level 12, Overconfidence effect. You're sure, absolutely sure, but you're wrong. That's the overconfidence effect, a mental blind spot where your certainty exceeds your accuracy. You believe you're right, not because you've checked the facts, but because doubt feels uncomfortable. It happens to all of us. You finish a test and think you aced it, only to find the mistakes were obvious in hindsight. You make a prediction and dismiss other outcomes, because entertaining uncertainty makes you feel weak. But confidence isn't a sign of truth. It's often just comfort. The louder the mind says, I know, the less room it makes for curiosity. This trap shows up in leadership, in politics, in relationships. You think you know what they meant, so you never ask. You think you've seen all the angles, so you stop listening. You think your plan is flawless, so you miss the cracks forming beneath it. And here's the danger. The more certain you feel, the less likely you are to grow. But wisdom isn't about being sure. It's about knowing when not to be. Real intelligence makes space for I might be wrong. Real strength allows room for correction. So next time you feel the rush of certainty, pause. Ask, what am I not seeing? What if I've misunderstood? What would change if I looked again? Because truth doesn't need to shout, and clarity isn't afraid of being challenged. You can stand firm and still stay open, because confidence built on humility isn't just powerful, it's real. If even one truth hit home, don't scroll. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Someone you love might need this more than you know. Level 13, Optimism bias. It'll work out, it'll be fine. Things like that don't happen to me. That's optimism bias. The brain's tendency to believe that the future will go better for you than it will for others. You don't plan for setbacks because you don't believe they'll come. You don't prepare for risk because you assume you'll be spared. It's comforting, it's flattering, and it's often dangerous. You see a friend lose their job and think, that won't happen to me. You read about a health scare and think, I'm different. You push off hard conversations, ignore the warning signs, avoid the checkup, because everything will be okay, until it's not. This bias isn't rooted in reality. It's rooted in protection. Your mind wants peace, so it manufactures it with illusions. But real peace doesn't come from ignoring reality. It comes from facing it and being ready. Optimism isn't wrong. Hope is not the enemy. But blind optimism? That's a cliff with no guardrail. There's a quiet strength in asking what could go wrong, not to invite fear. Optimism bias keeps you unprepared. It makes you underestimate how long things will take, how hard change will be, how much discomfort you'll need to endure. And then, when reality doesn't match the fantasy, you don't just feel surprised, you feel betrayed. But here's the truth. You can expect good things and still plan for difficulty. You can believe in the best and still prepare for the worst. Because real confidence isn't the belief that nothing will go wrong. It's the belief that you'll be ready when it does. Level 14, neglect of probability. You worry about the wrong things. You fear flying, but text while driving. You avoid elevators, but smoke every day. You lock the doors at night, but ignore the stress quietly killing you from within. That's neglect of probability. The mind's habit of fearing what feels scary, not what's actually likely. You confuse intensity with danger. You confuse headlines with risk. You mistake emotion for math. And suddenly, the actual odds don't matter. You feel unsafe, so you assume you are. You feel lucky, so you assume you're invincible. But numbers don't care how you feel. Reality doesn't adjust to your intuition. This trap is why people panic over plane crashes, but not over poor health habits. It's why you might avoid a city for its crime rate, but never examine the daily stress that quietly erodes your peace. The real danger is often the one you don't fear, because it doesn't make noise. Neglect of probability isn't about being careless. It's about letting emotion do the math when the numbers are trying to tell you something else. And it's not just about fear, it's about hope too. You believe your business will go viral because you saw someone else do it. You believe the lottery will save you because one story lit up your imagination. And all the real odds, they fade into the background. But here's the shift. You don't need to live by numbers, but you can't live against them either. Ask, what am I reacting to? The risk or just the feeling? What am I ignoring because it doesn't make headlines, but could make or break my future? Wisdom lives. Level 15, framing effect. 2 stories, same facts, different frames, different decisions. That's the framing effect, where the way something is said becomes more powerful than what is true. You're told, this treatment has a 90% success rate, and you feel hopeful. Then you're told, there's a 10% chance it fails, and you feel anxious. Different emotion, different choice. The facts didn't change, you did. Because the brain doesn't respond to logic first, tone, framing. This trap is why politicians say freedom instead of restriction. Why marketers say you save 20% instead of you spend 80%. Why we support something when it's called protection, but fear it when it's called control. And it works both ways. You don't just get framed, you frame yourself. You say, I failed, instead of, I'm still learning. You say, I lost everything, instead of, I'm being forced to start fresh. Language creates lens, and lens creates reality. This trap shapes not only how you view the world, but how you view yourself. And that means you can choose, not just what happens, but how you name it. You can tell the story as collapse or as transformation, as punishment or as redirection, as ending or as beginning. The power isn't in the event, it's in the frame. So ask, what would this look like if I told it differently? What's another way to see this that still honors the truth? Because sometimes healing isn't about what changes. It's about how you describe what stayed the same. Level 16, availability heuristic. You remember it vividly, so it must be true. You saw the plane crash on the news. Now flying feels terrifying, even though it's safer than driving. You read about a failed startup. Now building your dream feels doomed. Even though thousands succeed quietly, you bout headlines. That's the availability heuristic. When your brain believes what's easiest to remember must be the most real. You base your judgment not on how likely something is, but on how memorable it feels. Your mind reaches for the loudest memory, the story that hit hardest, not the one that reflects reality. And so, the data disappears, logic gets muted, and fear gets the microphone. You think, that happened to someone I know. That one article said. I saw a TikTok where that one instance becomes your expectation. You avoid starting, you avoid trusting, you avoid living, because one story lit up your survival response. But here's the danger. The things that stand out aren't always the things that stand for truth. The tragedy that went viral? Rare. The calm, ordinary peace in millions of lives? Silent. The mistake you made 10 years ago? You still replay it. But what about the 10 quiet wins that followed? This trap shrinks your world down to the stories that scared you most. But memory is not a mirror. It's a spotlight. And it doesn't always shine in the direction. Level 17, cognitive dissonance. You believe one thing, but do another, and your mind can't sit still. That's cognitive dissonance. The mental tension that arises when your actions and beliefs don't match. You believe in honesty, but you lie to protect someone. You value health, but you skip the gym again. You pride yourself on kindness, but snap at the person you love. And afterward, something tightens in your chest. Not guilt, not shame, something deeper with yourself. Because the story you tell about who you are doesn't line up with what you just did. And your mind can't handle the gap. So it starts rewriting the story. I didn't have a choice. They deserved it. It's just this once. I'll fix it later. You bend truth to relieve the tension. Not because you're a liar, but because you're scared. Scared of being wrong. Scared of not being who you thought you were. Scared of discovering you're the villain in your own narrative. But here's the shift. This discomfort isn't a curse. It's a compass. It's your mind alerting you. You've drifted from yourself. Or realign your path. You can either justify the dissonance or face it and choose better. Growth is painful because it demands honesty, not perfection, not self-punishment, just truth. The truth that maybe you're not as consistent as you want to be. The truth that maybe your values are still under construction. And that's okay, because what matters most is not avoiding dissonance, but listening to it. Let it humble you. Let it guide you to who you meant to be. Level 18, Survivorship Bias. You see the winners. You don't see the rest. You hear the success story, the startup that made it, the artist who went viral, the millionaire who dropped out of school. And you think, I just need to do what they did. That's survivorship bias, when your mind focuses only on those who succeeded and forgets the thousands who followed the same path, but disappeared without applause. You're shown the one who made it big, but not the hundreds who tried and failed, did everything right, and still got left behind. You see the athlete who trained at 5 a.m. and won gold, so you start setting your alarm. But what about the others who trained just as hard and still didn't make it? The media shows you the top 1%. The system rewards the outlier. But the story gets twisted. It wasn't just hard work. It wasn't just mindset. It wasn't just discipline. Sometimes it was luck, timing, connections, privilege you couldn't see. And if you don't question what's missing, you'll build your life on half a map. You'll chase a strategy that was never repeatable. You'll blame yourself when it doesn't work. You'll think, what's wrong with me? Instead of asking, what part of the story did they leave out? But this trap isn't just about business or fame. It's personal. You compare your pain to someone else's strength, not realizing they edited their struggle out of view. You measure your speed against someone else's highlight reel. You see who survived and assume their path was the blueprint. But what you don't see might be the most important part of all. Here's the truth. You're not here to mimic the survivors. You're here to learn from the whole story, even the parts that were never told. Success isn't always repeatable, but truth is always teachable. So look deeper. Ask what's missing. And remember, the invisible don't fail to matter. They just didn't get a microphone. Level 19, Groupthink. Everyone agrees, so you keep quiet. You feel that something's off, but no one else is saying anything. So you nod. You smile. You go along. That's groupthink, the invisible pressure to conform that trades truth for harmony. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to seem difficult. So you stay silent, even when your gut screams, even when your mind knows better. This trap shows up in boardrooms, in friend groups, in families, in online spaces where everyone thinks the same way, and any dissent feels like betrayal. It's the fear of rejection, disguised as agreement. The lie that says, if I speak, I'll ruin this. But sometimes, not speaking is what ruins it. Groupthink is not consensus. It's collapse. Of courage, of complexity, of critical thought. Because when everyone agrees too easily, it's rarely because they all believe. Afraid to stand out. Afraid to be wrong. Afraid to be alone. But progress doesn't happen in perfect circles. It happens at the edge, where someone says, I see it differently. So ask yourself, am I agreeing or avoiding? Am I silent because I believe or because I'm scared? It takes more strength to challenge the room than to echo it. And yes, you might be uncomfortable. You might be misjudged. You might even be dismissed. But you'll still have your voice. And that voice is what keeps the world honest. Level 20. Misinformation effect. You remember what happened. Or at least you think you do. But the details? They've changed. That's the misinformation effect. The brain's tendency to absorb new, false information and blend it into your memories, like it was always there. You hear someone else's version of a story, and suddenly, it feels like your own. You see a photo from years ago, and remember emotions that may not have existed. You hear a rumor, and now your original memory starts to shift. This isn't manipulation. It's biology. Your memories aren't files stored on a hard drive. They're stories. And each time you recall one, you edit it. A little. A word here. A feeling there. A detail reshaped by time, emotion, and influence. And over time, what you remember may not be what actually happened. This trap distorts your past. It makes you question what was real. And worse, it can be used against you. In arguments, in headlines, in propaganda. As memory, ye truth can be rewritten. But the house and tower and realization. Not every aim of the Burmese Convention is accurate. Level 21, false consensus effect. You assume everyone thinks like you do, feels what you feel, sees what you see. That's the false consensus effect. The illusion that your beliefs are more common than they actually are. You tell yourself, most people agree with this. Everyone sees it this way. Only a few outliers think differently. But have you asked? Have you truly listened? Or have you just surrounded yourself with echoes? This trap happens quietly. You curate your feed, block what bothers you, follow what affirms you, and soon, you're not seeing the world. You're seeing a reflection of your own mind. You begin to mistake familiarity for truth, repetition for consensus, agreement for reality. But the world is larger than your circle, louder than your timeline, wider than your beliefs. And when you forget that, you become more confident, but less connected. You argue harder, defend louder, assume more while understanding less. This trap isn't about arrogance. It's about insulation. You build a mental tribe and assume the rest of the world belongs to it too. But truth doesn't live in majority, and being surrounded by sameness doesn't mean you're right. So here's the shift. Start asking, what else could be true? What haven't I heard yet? Who disagrees and why? Not to change your mind, but to widen it. Because you don't need everyone to agree with you. You just need to remember that they don't have to. And that is how perspective becomes power. Level 22, framing risk. You hear two versions of the same outcome. 10% chance of failure, 90% chance of success. Which one feels safer? That's framing risk, when the way danger is presented shapes how real it feels, even if the numbers don't change. You could hear 5 out of 100 people die, or 95 out of 100 survive. Same statistic, different reaction, because your brain doesn't just calculate risk, it feels it. Feelings don't respond to logic. They respond to language. This trap is everywhere. In news headlines, in political speeches, in product labels. Only 1% side effects sounds fine until someone reframes it. 1 in every 100 people suffers. And now you hesitate, because fear is faster than facts, and the frame can be more powerful than the content inside it. But this doesn't just happen to you, it happens through you. You reframe things in your own mind without realizing. You say, I failed, instead of, I lost everything, instead of, I was forced to start again. And the emotion you attach isn't just about what happened. It's about how you told it. Framing risk is not about lying. It's about recognizing that reality is often neutral until we put words around it. So be careful what frame you use, because you're not just describing the situation, you're shaping your response to it. You can't eliminate risk, but you can choose to meet it without panic, with perspective, with presence, with the power to name what's true, even when it's hard. Because how you frame the risk often decides whether you walk forward or walk away. Level 23, status quo bias. You know it's not working, but you stay. not because it's right, but because it's familiar. That's status quo bias, the psychological pull to keep things the way they are, just because they've always been that way. You tell yourself, this is just how I am. This is how things work. This is better than risking the unknown. Even if the unknown is slowly draining you, you stay in the relationship, not because there's love, but because there's history. You keep the job, not because it fulfills you, but because you're used to the routine. You keep thinking the same thoughts, living the same habits, telling the same story, because changing it feels like betrayal. But the truth is, familiar isn't always safe. Comfort isn't always peace, and tradition isn't always truth. This trap whispers, don't rock the boat, don't fix what isn't broken, don't walk into the unknown. But the boat is already sinking, and the brokenness, you've just learned to ignore the cracks. Here's the truth. Growth begins where your loyalty to the familiar ends. You don't have to burn everything down, but you do have to ask, if I were starting from scratch, would I choose this? Would I choose this belief, this relationship, this lifestyle? Or have I just let time do the choosing for me? Status quo bias keeps you stuck by convincing you that effort is worse than misery. But the price of never changing is far greater than the cost of trying, because nothing keeps you trapped longer than the story that says, Level 24, authority bias. They speak with confidence. They wear the title. They sound certain. So you assume they must be right. That's authority bias, the tendency to trust someone's opinion just because they hold a position of power, not because they've earned it. You follow the expert, the leader, the influencer, the doctor, the parent, the teacher, and slowly you stop asking questions because challenging them feels like challenging the truth. But authority doesn't equal wisdom, and power doesn't equal clarity. This trap can lead you down paths you never meant to walk, not because you were forced, but because you never thought to resist. It shows up in boardrooms, when no one questions the CEO. In classrooms, when the teacher's word ends the conversation. In society, when titles become shields against accountability. And it shows up in you, when you silence your own voice in the presence of someone else's certainty. You assume they must know better. They've done this longer. They sound so sure. But sounding sure is not the same as being right. Authority can guide, but it should never blind. Respect is earned, not assumed. And truth can withstand questioning. So ask, challenge, verify. Not to be rebellious, but to be responsible. Because if you hand over your judgment to someone just because they seem credible, you don't just risk being wrong, you risk living someone else's life. Here's the shift. You can learn from others without losing your intuition. You can take advice without abandoning your intuition. And you can respect authority. Wow. Level 25. Illusion of control. You throw the dice harder, thinking it might change the outcome. You make plans down to the minute, believing it will protect you from chaos. You check the stove 3 times, even though it's already off. That's the illusion of control. The belief that your actions can influence outcomes that are largely random, uncertain, or out of your hands. It's not just superstition. It's survival. Because certainty feels safe, control feels powerful, and surrender feels terrifying. So you convince yourself, if I worry enough, I'll be ready. If I plan harder, nothing can go wrong. If I keep trying, they'll finally change, quote. And when the world doesn't bend to your effort, you don't blame the illusion. You blame yourself. You think you failed, when really, you never had control to begin with. This trap turns life into a chessboard, where you believe every piece should move because you planned it. But people aren't pawns. Weather doesn't care about your calendar. And love can't be forced into staying. Here's the truth. You control your effort, not the outcome. You control your response, not the result. You control your choices, not the consequences that follow every time. And that's enough. Letting go of the illusion isn't giving up. Level 26, procrastination bias. You'll do it tomorrow, next week, when you feel ready, when it's the right time. That's procrastination bias. The belief that your future self will be stronger, smarter, more motivated than you are today. So you wait, you postpone, you delay the discomfort, and convince yourself it's strategy. But here's what really happens. You avoid the hard thing and replace it with the easy one. You check your email instead of starting the project. You clean the kitchen instead of writing the book. You scroll instead of facing the thing that makes your stomach tighten. You say, I work better under pressure. But often, that pressure isn't power. It's panic. This trap doesn't just steal time. It steals trust. Because every time you break a promise to yourself, your belief in your own follow-through weakens. You start to question, will I really do it next time? Am I the kind of person who finishes things? And slowly, you become someone you can't rely on. Not because you're lazy, not because you're weak, but because you believed a lie. That avoiding something today would make it easier tomorrow. But fear doesn't shrink when ignored. It grows. And the only way to make a task lighter is to begin carrying it. You don't need the full plan. You just need the courage to take the first honest step. Because readiness isn't a mood, it's a decision. And your future self? They're just you, but a few hours older. Level 27, conformity bias. You look around, no one's speaking up, no one's stepping out. So you stay quiet, you blend in, you nod along. That's conformity bias, the pressure to match the group, even when it costs you your truth. You feel the hesitation, you see the flaw, you know something's off, but still, you follow, not because you're convinced, but because you don't want to be alone. This trap is ancient. In tribal times, to go against the group meant danger, exile, isolation, death. And even now, your nervous system remembers, so you say what they say, wear what they wear, think what they think, until your voice becomes an echo of the room you're standing in. You call it being polite, being respectful. But sometimes it's just fear wearing a mask called agreement. Conformity bias is how injustice survives. It's how silence spreads. It's how truth gets buried under the weight of fit in. But your instincts, your inner knowing, they don't belong to the crowd. They belong to you. So when the room leans one way, but your body leans another, listen. When everyone laughs, but you feel discomfort rising, don't dismiss it. Because it takes no courage to echo. It takes all the courage in the world to speak with your own voice when no one else is. Here's the truth. You weren't born to blend. You were born to be brave. Level 28, Familiarity Heuristic. You've seen it before, so it must be right. You've heard it before, so it must be true. That's the Familiarity Heuristic. The mental shortcut that makes you trust what's known more than what's true. You reach for the same brand, choose the same routine, trust the same voices, not because they're best, but because they're familiar. It's why you stay in unhealthy relationships, why you keep repeating old habits, why you stop questioning things you've heard 100 times. The mind equates repetition with reliability over the uncomfortable truth. You're more likely to believe a false statement if you've heard it often, more likely to choose a worse option if it feels familiar, more likely to trust the wrong person if they remind you of someone you once loved. But comfort is not confirmation, and repetition is not reality. This trap shapes your choices before you even realize you're making one. You scroll past new ideas, you overlook new people, you bypass growth because it's wearing a face you don't recognize, and you start mistaking the echo for evidence. But here's the shift. New isn't always risky. Unfamiliar doesn't mean unsafe. And if you want a different life, you have to let go of the instinct to only trust what you've seen before. The life you want may not speak the language you're used to. It may not walk in looking like your past. It may not feel familiar until it becomes your new normal. And that's okay, because familiarity isn't a compass. It's just a pattern, and you're allowed to break it. Level 29, outcome bias. It worked out, so it must have been the right decision. It failed, so it must have been the wrong one. That's outcome bias. When you judge the quality of a choice based solely on how it ended, not how it was made, you took a reckless risk but got lucky. So you call it brilliance. You made a thoughtful, careful choice that didn't go as planned. So you call it stupidity. This trap blinds you to the process. It teaches you to praise results, not effort, to punish failure, even when it came from courage. And it poisons growth, because if failure means bad decision, you'll stop taking healthy risks. You'll only choose what's safe, not what's right. You'll shrink your life down to what you can guarantee and call it wisdom. But reality isn't that simple. Good decisions can lead to bad outcomes. Bad decisions can sometimes be rewarded. Life is messy. Chance is real, and you're not always in control of how things end. But you are responsible for how you choose. This bias shows up in how we treat others too. We admire the successful without asking what they compromised. We dismiss the struggling without knowing how wise their journey really was. Here's the shift. Judge the decision, not the result. Ask, did I think it through? Was I brave? Was I honest? Did I act from integrity, not impulse? Because character isn't built on what you achieve. It's built on how you choose. And the truth is, the right path might still lead through failure. Level 30, intuition over analysis. You just know. You can't explain it. You didn't check the facts. But your gut says yes, so you listen. That's intuition over analysis. The belief that your instincts are always wiser than your logic. It feels romantic, empowering, pure. And sometimes it's right. Sometimes your body knows what your brain can't articulate. Sometimes a whisper of don't has saved a life. Sometimes a pull toward go has changed a destiny. But intuition is not infallible, because it doesn't just draw from wisdom. It draws from fear, from memory, from bias, from trauma you never healed, and stories you never questioned. You feel a bad vibe, but maybe it's just unfamiliarity. You trust someone instantly, but maybe they remind you of a voice you once needed. When you skip analysis completely, you skip context, you skip complexity. You skip the opportunity to learn something deeper than what your gut guessed. This trap shows up when decisions are rushed, when ego disguises itself as instinct, when fear wears the costume of intuition. Here's the shift. You can trust your gut, but you don't have to obey it without question. Let your intuition raise the flag. Then let your reason walk the field. Ask, why do I feel this way? What's influencing this response? What data have I ignored because I was already emotionally convinced? Wisdom is the dance between instinct and inquiry. And when they move together, you don't just feel aligned, you are. Level 31, hindsight bias. You look back, and suddenly it all seems obvious. That was bound to happen. I knew it all along. I should have seen the signs. That's hindsight bias. The illusion that the outcome was predictable, inevitable, or even your fault. When in truth, it wasn't. You convince yourself you could have done better, should have known more, should have avoided the mistake. You play your past like a movie you've already seen, forgetting that, back then, you were watching it unfold for the first time. This trap rewrites your memory to match your current understanding. You forget how confused you were, how different the options felt. You hold your former self to the standard of your current clarity and call it justice. But it's not justice. It's judgment. This bias fuels self-blame. It distorts learning. It makes you afraid to try again because now you should have known better. But here's the truth. Clarity isn't a time machine. Knowing now doesn't mean you could have known then. Hindsight bias doesn't just affect your past. It affects how you view others. Because now the outcome is clear, but in their moment, the fog was real. And sometimes, we make the best choice possible from inside that fog. Here's the shift. Instead of asking, "How didn't I see this?" ask, "What did I learn that I couldn't have known?" Instead of saying, "I should have known," say, "I grew because I didn't." Because growth. Level 32, curse of knowledge. You know something now, so you forget what it felt like not to know. That's the curse of knowledge. When the more you understand, the harder it becomes to imagine what it's like not to. You try to explain something simple, but you use words that confuse. You expect others to keep up, but they're still at the starting line. You grow frustrated, not because they're slow, but because you forgot what learning once felt like. It affects compassion. You judge someone for struggling, but you don't remember the first time you did. You roll your eyes at their questions, forgetting how long it took you to ask the same ones. You teach too quickly, listen too little, assume too much. The curse of knowledge convinces you that what's obvious now was always obvious. But it wasn't. You earned your understanding, step by step, through confusion, mistakes, humility. And if you forget that, you become unreachable. This trap breaks down relationships. It turns teachers into tyrants, leaders into lecturers, loved ones into strangers. Because nothing creates distance faster than assuming everyone should know what you didn't always know yourself. Here's the shift. Slow down. Speak simply. Teach gently. Lead with patience. Ask, what would I have needed if I were just starting? Because level 33, gambler's fallacy. It didn't happen last time, so it has to happen now. That's the gambler's fallacy, the false belief that random events somehow balance each other out. You flip a coin 5 times, and it lands on heads every time. So you think tails is due. But chance doesn't keep score. The coin doesn't remember. The dice don't care. The universe is not adjusting its outcome to be fair. And yet, your brain insists that it is. This trap doesn't just live in casinos. It lives in your daily life. You stay in a bad relationship because you believe it's time for something to finally go right. You keep pouring effort into a project that's failing because you're due for a win. You trust someone who's hurt you too many times already, and surely they can't hurt you again. But pain doesn't run on a schedule. Luck isn't a pendulum, and the fallacy convinces you to chase patterns that don't exist. It feeds addiction. It sustains hope in places that only drain you. It convinces you that the next time will be the turning point, even when nothing has changed. Here's the shift. You are allowed to hope isn't built on false math. Ask, am I making this choice because the odds changed, or because I wish they did? Am I holding on because I've seen growth, or because I can't accept letting go? But there is also power in knowing when the game isn't worth playing. You don't owe your past any more of your future. Level 34, magical thinking. If I don't say it out loud, maybe it won't happen. If I think positive thoughts, I'll be protected. If I step in a certain way, say the right words, touch the lucky object, things will go my way. That's magical thinking. The belief that your thoughts, words, or small actions can influence outcomes that are completely out of your control. It begins innocently. You whisper a wish before blowing out candles, you knock on wood, you avoid speaking your fears as if saying them aloud might bring them to life. You cling to the idea that your rituals, your mind, can bend the world around you. And sometimes that comfort is harmless, but sometimes it becomes a cage. You blame yourself for a loved one's illness because you thought something negative. You replay a bad moment and wonder if you invited it. You keep up endless habits out of fear that if you don't, the worst will find you. You trade reality for illusion and call it safety. But the truth is, the universe doesn't work like that. You are powerful, but not omnipotent. You can influence your response. You can shape your perspective. You can act with intention, but you cannot control the uncontrollable by thinking the right thoughts or fearing the wrong ones. Here's the shift. Let go of the need to feel responsible for what was never in your hands. You are not a god. You are not a curse. You are not to blame for what happened beyond your control. And letting go of magical thinking doesn't make you powerless. It makes you free. Level 35. Just world hypothesis. They must have deserved it. She must have done something wrong. Bad things don't just happen. That's the just world hypothesis. The belief that the world is fair. That good things happen to good people. And that pain must mean punishment. It comforts you. It makes sense of chaos. Bad things can't touch me. But it's a lie. The world is not fair. Good people suffer. Kindness is not always rewarded. And cruelty is not always punished. This trap doesn't protect you. It blinds you. It makes you look at someone's suffering and search for a reason that justifies it, so you can sleep better at night. You hear someone lost their job, got sick, was betrayed, and you think, there must have done something wrong. They probably ignored it. I wouldn't have let that happen. Because if bad things happen for no reason, then they could happen to you. And that's terrifying. So you rewrite reality to feel safe. But safety built on denial is not compassion at all. This trap shows up inward too. When life hurts, you assume it's your fault. When something ends, you believe it's because you didn't try hard enough. You punish yourself for the random cruelty of life. Here's the truth. Bad things happen to people who never deserved them. And trying to force life into a fair equation will only break your heart faster. You don't have to find the reason. You just have to find the humanity. So ask, am I seeking fairness or avoiding fear? Because the world isn't always just, but you still can be. Level 36, appeal to ignorance. There's no evidence against it, so it must be true. No one's proven it wrong, so it must be right. That's the appeal to ignorance, the mental trap where a lack of disproof gets mistaken for proof. You hear an outrageous claim. There's no evidence to support it, but there's no evidence against it either. So part of you starts to believe. You think, well, you never know. Maybe it's real. No one's disproven it yet. But absence of evidence is not evidence of truth. This is how myths spread, how misinformation takes root, how bad ideas gain traction just because they're hard to disprove. You can't prove that aliens don't exist. You can't prove that a cure doesn't work. You can't prove that someone's not lying. And so, doubt creeps in. Certainty follows close behind. But this trap isn't just about belief. It's about fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of not knowing. Fear of admitting, I don't have enough information. So instead of sitting in the unknown, you fill the silence with assumptions, and slowly, you lose your tolerance for truth that hasn't yet arrived. Here's the shift. Learn to pause before you believe. Learn to say, I don't know, without rushing to a false yes or no. The space between proven and disproven is where wisdom waits. Because truth is not afraid of time. It doesn't demand immediate belief. It doesn't shout in the void. It arrives quietly, once you've cleared away what was never real to begin with. Level 37, confirmation bias in research. You ask a question, but only look for answers that agree with you. You run an experiment, but ignore the results that don't fit. You cite the study, but skip the parts that contradict your point. That's confirmation bias in research, the tendency to search for, interpret, and even collect data while dismissing the rest. This isn't just about cherry-picking facts. It's about crafting a version of truth that feels comfortable, unquestioned, safe. You go into the search not to discover, but to defend. And when research becomes defense, it stops being science. It becomes storytelling, propaganda, self-reassurance, masquerading as objectivity. This trap shows up in everyday people and in trained professionals, in journalism, in politics, in academia, in medicine, and especially in you. You Google a question. You click the link that agrees. You scroll past the rest. You highlight the study that supports your argument, but never read the methodology. You quote a number, but not its context. You say, the science says, when what you really mean is, I found someone who agrees with me. Here's the shift. Truth isn't afraid of contradiction. It invites it. It sharpens through it. So instead of asking, how do I prove myself right? Ask, what would it take to prove myself wrong? Instead of fearing the data that challenges you, welcome it. Because research isn't about building a case. It's about becoming humble enough to let go of the one you already built. Level 38, pessimism bias. You expect the worst. You prepare for failure. You assume it will hurt, so you brace for it before it even begins. That's pessimism bias, the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes and underestimate your own ability to handle them. It feels like realism, like caution, like maturity. But underneath, it's fear wearing the mask of wisdom, because disappointment feels inevitable. You don't let yourself feel excited, because good things always fall apart, right? You say things like, probably won't work out. Don't get your hopes up. Knowing my luck. And slowly, you teach yourself to shrink in advance, just in case life decides to shrink you anyway. This trap protects you from hope, because hope makes you vulnerable. Hope requires courage. Hope risks heartbreak. So instead, you expect the fall. You emotionally rehearse the worst-case scenario so that if it comes, you will be surprised. But the cost is quiet and enormous. You miss out on joy, on possibility, on fully experiencing the good that does happen because you were too busy preparing for it not to. Here's the truth. Expecting pain doesn't prevent it. It just drains your joy in the meantime. You don't need to pretend everything will go perfectly, but you can start allowing for the chance that things might go right. Ask, what if this time is different? What if I'm more ready than I think? What if the risk is worth the opening? Because the future isn't always cruel, and not every step. If even one truth hit home, don't scroll. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Someone you love might need this more than you know. Level 39, risk aversion. You could win, you could grow, you could step into something extraordinary, but there's a chance it might go wrong, so you don't even try. That's risk aversion, the mental trap where the fear of loss outweighs the potential of gain. You don't apply for the job because rejection might hurt. You don't confess your feelings because it might not be mutual. You don't take the leap because you might fall. So you stay in the known, in the predictable, in the life you didn't choose, but one that never surprises you. And here's the twist. You think you're avoiding pain, but what you're really avoiding is possibility. Because no life of meaning comes without risk. This trap teaches you to calculate everything, to overthink, to wait for certainty, to demand guarantees. Love doesn't come with safety nets, and transformation is never risk-free. Risk aversion doesn't just kill dreams. It kills momentum. It trains you to settle for less, because less feels manageable. But here's the truth. Not taking the risk is a risk. Because you might wake up one day and realize you were so busy protecting your comfort, you forgot to build a life you were excited to live. So ask, what am I really afraid of? Is the risk greater than the regret of not trying? What's the cost of staying here forever? You don't have to be reckless, but you do have to be willing. Because courage isn't the absence of risk. It's the decision to step forward, even though risk exists. Level 40, false dichotomy. You either win or you lose. You're either with us or against us. You succeed or you fail. That's the false dichotomy. The illusion that there are only two choices, two paths, two types of people, right or wrong, good or bad. It simplifies the world. It makes things feel certain. It gives you a quick answer at the cost of truth. Because real life isn't binary. It's layered, messy, complicated, human. You're not just strong or weak. You're not only logical or broken. You can be both. You can be becoming. This trap shows up in how we judge others. She's either a hero or a villain. He's either right or completely wrong. They're either woke or brainwashed. They're either part of the problem or part of the solution. But people are more than labels, more than checkboxes, more than the extremes we use to feel superior or safe. False dichotomies exist to make you choose sides instead of think, to rush decisions instead of reflect, to divide people instead of understand them. And worst of all, this trap turns inward. You say, if I can't be perfect, why try? If I mess up once, I've failed. If I'm not confident all the time, I'm a fraud. But you don't have to be all one thing. You can doubt and still act. You can fall and still be growing. You can hold two truths in the same hand. Here's the shift. Next time someone says, you have to choose, ask, why only those two options? What am I not being shown? Where's the third path? Because the truth usually lives somewhere in between. Level 41, appeal to emotion. It made you feel something, so you believed it. That's the appeal to emotion, a mental shortcut where emotional impact is mistaken for logical strength. It's when someone skips the facts and goes straight for your heart. They cry on cue. They raise their voice, stories, pain, and suddenly you believe them. Not because what they said was true, but because of how it made you feel. It shows up in politics, in marketing, in media, in arguments with people you love. This child is suffering, so this policy must be right. They're angry, so they must be telling the truth. Their ad made me cry, so the product must be good. They hurt me, so they must be evil. But emotions are not evidence. They are reactions. They can highlight truth, but they can also distract from it. This trap convinces you that if something moves you deeply, it must be real. But even lies can be told beautifully. Even manipulation can make you weep. Even your own stories. I've suffered, so they must be telling the truth. They're angry, so they must be telling the truth. This ad made me cry, so the product must be good. They hurt me, so they must be evil. But Level 42, appeal to tradition. Why do we do it this way? Because we always have. That's the appeal to tradition. The belief that something must be right just because it's old. You follow the rule, honor the custom, repeat the behavior. Not because it still serves you, but because it feels familiar. You say, this is how I was raised. This is just the way it's done. This is how it's always been. And slowly, you stop questioning. Tradition becomes truth. History becomes law. And the past becomes a cage, disguised as a compass. This trap shows up in culture, in family, in religion, in leadership. It says, don't ask, don't doubt, don't change. It convinces you that breaking from tradition is disrespect, that evolving is dangerous. But here's the quiet truth. Tradition can be beautiful, but it is not sacred. What worked then might harm now. What guided the past might limit the future. This doesn't mean all tradition is bad, but it does mean not all of it should stay. You're allowed to examine what you were given. You're allowed to let go of the rest, because growth doesn't dishonor your roots. It honors them by asking which part still gives life and which part has gone hollow. Here's the shift. Let tradition be a starting point, not a finish line. Let it be a foundation, not a ceiling. And remember, the torch isn't just meant to be held. It's meant to light new paths. Level 43, Spotlight Effect. You walk into the room and you feel it. Every eye on you. Every flaw exposed. Every move remembered. That's the spotlight effect. The belief that people notice you far more than they actually do. You stumble over your words and replay it for hours. You wear the wrong outfit and feel like the whole world saw it. You make one mistake and assume it's what everyone will remember. But here's the truth. Most people aren't watching. They're too busy wondering if you're watching them. They're rehearsing their own stumbles, their own anxieties, their own invisible spotlights. You are not the center of their world because they are the center of theirs. This trap makes you self-conscious, makes you afraid to try, makes you hide when you should shine. It convinces you that one awkward laugh, one bad day, one imperfect attempt has defined you forever. But no one is archiving your moments like you are. The spotlight, it's in your mind, not on you. And when you realize that, you breathe easier. You move more freely. You stop needing to be flawless just to be seen. Here's the shift. Let go of the imaginary audience. Stop performing for eyes that aren't looking. Stop shrinking for a judgment that isn't happening. You are allowed to show up fully, awkwardly, imperfectly, because you're not being watched. You're being human. And most people aren't thinking about you because they're thinking about themselves. Level 44, false memory syndrome. You remember the look on their face, the words they said, the feeling in the room. It's so vivid, it has to be real. But what if it wasn't? That's false memory syndrome, the mind's tendency to form memories of things that never happened or happened differently than you recall. Not because you're lying, not because you're making it up, but because your memory is not a camera. It's a storybook, written and rewritten by emotion, suggestion, and time. Someone asks, "Are you sure?" And you say, "I know what I saw." But do you? You might be remembering how you felt, not what actually happened. You might be filling in gaps with pieces of imagination, with someone else's version, with a dream that slowly melted into memory. And here's the terrifying part. It feels just as real as the truth. This trap affects everything. Your relationships, your sense of justice, your identity. You carry shame for something that wasn't your fault. You hold a grudge for something that never happened the way you think. You mourn a past that didn't unfold quite like you remember. But here's the grace. False memory doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. Your brain protects you. It edits, it fills in blanks, it makes meaning from confusion, even if the meaning wasn't there. So here's the shift. Hold your memories gently. Don't worship them. Don't weaponize them. Don't assume they're flawless just because they feel certain. Ask, is it possible I don't remember this exactly? What role did emotion play? What might I have filled in with fear or pain? Because sometimes healing requires you to rewrite the past, not to lie to yourself, but to see more clearly. Level 45, availability cascade. We've heard it before, again and again, in headlines, in comments, in conversations. So you start to think, it must be true. That's the availability cascade, a psychological trap where repetition becomes validation, not because of logic, not because of evidence, but because of familiarity. You hear the same idea repeated, a conspiracy, a stereotype, a false statistic, a half-truth, until it starts to feel obvious. You think, I keep hearing this, so it must be real. Everyone's saying it, so it must be right. It's everywhere, so how can it be wrong? But the truth doesn't grow louder just because it's true. And a lie doesn't become truth just because it echoes. This trap fuels misinformation. It empowers propaganda. It tricks smart people into believing dumb ideas. Because the more something gets repeated, the easier it is for your brain to retrieve it. And the easier it is to retrieve, the more true it feels. It's not your fault. It's your wiring. Your brain uses speed as a shortcut. Familiar equals safe. Repeated equals reliable. But here's the danger. Loud doesn't mean correct. Popular doesn't mean pure. Viral doesn't mean valuable. This trap infects public opinion. It warps memory. It drowns out quieter truths that haven't been echoed yet. Here's the shift. Ask yourself, have I examined this or just heard it a lot? Do I believe this because of facts? Level 46, self-serving bias. When things go right, you take the credit. When things go wrong, you blame the circumstances. That's the self-serving bias, the mind's instinct to protect the ego by rewriting the cause. You succeed on a test, it's because you're smart. You fail the next one, it's because the questions were unfair. You land the job, it's your talent. You lose the job, it was politics. You hold the victory close and push the failure away. This trap doesn't just distort the past, it destroys growth. Because if every failure was someone else's fault, you never change. If every win was purely your doing, you stop learning. And slowly, you build a version of yourself that can't be challenged. A version that must be right, must be praised, must be protected. But here's the truth. You're not always the victim. You're not always the genius. You're not always right. And that's okay. Because self-worth, built on fragile pride, shatters the moment reality enters. But humility? That's bulletproof. This trap also infects relationships. You blame them when you're hurt. You take credit when they're healed. You paint yourself as the reasonable one, even when you were unkind. But growth begins when you stop defending the story and start exploring the truth. Here's the shift. Ask, what part of this was me? What am I responsible for? What can I learn, even when I lose? Because maturity is knowing you're not the villain, you're not the victim, you're just human. And that means you are both the problem and the solution. Level 47, sunk cost fallacy. You've spent the time, you've spent the energy, you've poured in your heart, so now you can't walk away. That's the sunk cost fallacy, the belief that you must keep going just because you've already gone so far. You stay in the relationship, not because it's right, but because it's lasted years. You keep the job, not because it's fulfilling, but because you've worked too hard to leave it now. You cling to the dream, not because it still calls to you, but because abandoning it feels like betrayal to the person you used to be. And so, you throw good energy after bad. You sacrifice your peace to avoid the pain of quitting. You build a life around a past version of yourself and call it loyalty. But loyalty to what no longer serves you is not devotion, it's self-sabotage. This trap convinces you that walking away is failure, that quitting is weakness, that letting go dishonors your effort. But here's the truth. What you've already spent is gone. Time, money, effort, love. None of it returns just because you keep bleeding. The question isn't, what did I already give? It's, what do I still have left to give? And where is it truly needed? You're allowed to change course. You're allowed to leave the movie halfway through if you realize it's not for you. You're allowed to say, I've given enough. Here's the shift. Level 48, Barnum effect. You read a horoscope, and it feels uncannily accurate. You take a personality quiz, and nod at every line. You hear, "You're the kind of person who wants to be liked, but also values independence." And think, "That's exactly me." That's the Barnum effect. The tendency to believe that vague, general statements are deeply personal and specific when they could apply to almost anyone. It feels magical, insightful, like someone finally understands you, but what they gave you wasn't truth. It was a carefully crafted illusion. Things that sound unique because they sound familiar. You have untapped potential. You sometimes doubt yourself. You care deeply, but don't always show it. Sound like you? It sounds like everyone. This trap works because it appeals to emotion. It flatters your ego. It makes you feel seen without challenging you to see yourself. You begin to build identity around statements that sound true simply because you want them to be. But here's the danger. The Barnum effect makes you more suggestible, more susceptible to manipulation, more likely to trust authority, not because they know you, but because they've said something that feels right. And you stop asking, "Is this accurate?" Instead, you ask, "Do I like how this sounds?" But liking something doesn't make it true. Here's the shift. Hold flattery loosely. Hold identity lightly and ask, could this apply to anyone? Is this vague or verifiable? Am I being understood or just being sold something comforting? You deserve real. Level 49, placebo effect. You take a sugar pill and the pain fades. You drink flavored water and start to feel stronger. You follow a ritual, believe in a cure, and suddenly you begin to heal. That's the placebo effect. When a treatment with no active ingredients produces real results simply because you believe it will. It's not fake. It's not in your head. It's your belief activating your body's own systems. Your mind says, "This is helping," and the body listens. This trap isn't dangerous by itself. In fact, it can be incredibly powerful. It shows the mind's influence on the body, how expectation shapes experience, how hope can trigger healing. But here's where it gets risky. You might start trusting the wrong source because it feels like it does, even when it's doing nothing, or even causing harm. You might pay for false hope, defend pseudoscience, ignore actual treatment because the last thing felt better. You confuse relief with results. You mistake comfort for cure. The placebo effect reveals your strength, but also your susceptibility. It's not a reason to stop trusting your instincts. It's a reason to question the source. Here's the shift. Honor what your belief can do, but don't let belief replace evidence. Ask, is this working because of the treatment or because of my trust in it? Am I feeling better or simply feeling more hopeful? Because hope is powerful. But truth is what keeps you grounded when hope alone is not enough. And the most healing force of all? A belief backed by reality. Level 50, nocebo effect. You feel sick before the medicine even reaches your mouth. You experience side effects after reading about them, even if what you took was a sugar pill. That's the nocebo effect, the flip side of the placebo, where belief doesn't heal, it hurts. You believe something will go wrong, so your body starts reacting as if it already has. You expect the pain, and pain shows up. You expect the fatigue, and your limbs grow heavy. You expect to fall apart, and your system obeys. It's not imagination. It's not attention-seeking. It's the mind communicating with the body through fear, expectation, and suggestion. And this trap doesn't just affect physical health. It affects relationships, careers, dreams. You believe you'll fail, so you stop trying. You believe you're unwanted, so you pull away first. You believe nothing good lasts, so you prepare to lose it before it's even real. Nocebo is the self-fulfilling prophecy of suffering, the biology of dread, the poison of unchallenged belief. This trap feeds on worry, on Google searches, on vague online diagnoses, on stories you tell yourself, and stories others told you first. Here's the shift. Not everything you feel is a sign of danger. Not everything uncomfortable is evidence of decline. Ask, is this pain real or a reflection of my fear? What if this feeling is a signal, but not a sentence? What might improve if I expected something better? Because belief is a blade, and it can cut both ways. So don't surrender your health, your joy, or your future to a prediction that was never promised. Level 51, framing bias. 2 sentences. Same truth, different feeling. 90% survival rate. 10% mortality rate. Which one feels safer? That's framing bias. To be influenced not by what's being said, but how it's said. You're shown a glass that's half full, and you feel hopeful. You're shown a glass that's half empty, and you feel cautious. But it's the same glass. This trap lives in marketing, in headlines, in politics, in your own mind. You see 95% effective and trust the treatment. You hear 5% failure, and suddenly doubt creeps in. Framing bias isn't about lying. It's how truth is dressed up to influence how it's received. It makes you trust what feels positive and fear what sounds negative, even if they're mathematically identical. And it affects more than numbers. You describe your day as long instead of full. You call your idea risky instead of bold. You frame your past as failure instead of foundation. You don't just frame the world, you frame yourself. This trap shapes your reality with the words you choose, and those words shape your future. Here's the shift. Notice the frame, then look for the facts beneath it. Ask, would I feel the same if this were worded differently? What emotion is this framing trying to evoke? How would I see this if I saw it with fresh eyes? Because truth doesn't change, but the story around it does. And once you see the frame, you can choose what it holds. Level 52, planning fallacy. You think it'll take a day. It takes a week. You think you'll finish by Friday. It's still unfinished a month later. You think this time will be different. That's the planning fallacy. The tendency to underestimate how much time, effort, or complexity a task will actually require. You imagine a perfect scenario. You'll be focused. There won't be delays. Everything will go according to plan. And when it doesn't, you feel like a failure. But the failure wasn't in the doing. It was in the forecast. This trap makes you say yes when you should say, that depends. It makes you commit to timelines that only exist in fantasy. It turns every project into a race against your own unrealistic expectations. It shows up in personal goals. You'll wake up early, start a new habit, write a book in a weekend. It shows up in work. You give a client the deadline they want instead of the one that's possible. And when it all takes longer, you beat yourself up because you believed you wouldn't struggle. Here's the truth. Most things take longer than you think because life happens. Interruptions happen. You happen. And that's not weakness. That's reality. The planning fallacy isn't just about poor time management. It's about poor self-compassion. It convinces you that real effort should be smooth, that good intentions should make the work go faster. But the work takes what it takes. Here's the shift. Add margin. Add breathing room. Expect setbacks. Plan for who you really are, not the perfect version you wish you were. Ask, if this took twice as long, would I still want to do it? Because success isn't about beating the clock just because the clock surprised you. Level 53, actor-observer bias. You cut someone off in traffic. You were in a rush. They cut you off. They're a jerk. You miss a deadline. You had a rough week. Someone else misses it. They're lazy or careless. That's the actor-observer bias. The tendency to explain your own behavior with context and compassion, but explain others' behavior with judgment and assumption. You see your life as a movie. You know the behind the scenes. You see the stress, the intentions, the things no one else can see. But when you look at someone else, you only see the final scene. And from there, you write the whole story. They snapped at you, so they must be rude. They didn't respond, so they must not care. You rarely ask, what might be happening off screen? This trap shows up in relationships, in conflict, in social media, in the tiny everyday moments where grace could be given, but isn't. And it goes both ways. When you mess up, you say, I had a reason. But when they mess up, you say, they are the reason. It's easier that way. Safer, cleaner, but not truer. Because we are all walking around with invisible context. With Cain no one sees. With moments we hope others will understand before they judge. Here's the shift. Next time someone disappoints you, pause. Ask, what would I believe about them if I knew what they were going through? And next time you judge yourself harshly, remember that the same grace you want from others is what you must offer to them, not even you. Level 54, negativity bias. You get 10 compliments and 1 insult. Which one do you remember? That's the negativity bias. The mind's tendency to focus more on what went wrong than on what went right. You fixate on the one rejection, not the 5 offers. You remember the one person who left, not the many who stayed. You replay the one mistake, not the 100 efforts. It's not weakness. Evolution taught you to prioritize danger, to scan for threat, to notice pain, because ignoring it meant extinction. But now, that same instinct leaves you drowning in shadows while the light goes unnoticed. Negativity bias turns small failures into full-blown identities. It convinces you that you're failing when you're just learning. It convinces you that you're unlovable when one cold moment outweighs years of warmth. It shows up in relationships. You focus on the one thing they didn't do instead of the dozen things they did. It shows up in self-talk. You repeat your flaws, but forget your growth. This trap makes the darkness louder and the joy a whisper. But here's the shift. You can retrain your mind to see the whole picture. It starts with noticing. Not pretending everything is perfect. Not denying pain. But refusing to let one dark stroke define the entire canvas. Ask, what else is true? What have I overlooked? What beauty am I ignoring because I was taught to hunt for danger? Because what you focus on grows, and sometimes the light needs you to turn your head, not just your heart. Level 55, clustering illusion. You see 2 bad things happen and assume a 3rd is coming. You notice similar numbers, repeating events, aligned signs, and you start to wonder, Is the universe trying to tell me something? That's the clustering illusion, the tendency to perceive patterns in random data. It's how your brain tries to make sense of chaos. It looks for meaning in noise, order in disorder. You flip a coin 5 times and get heads each time. Your brain screams, tails is due. You see a tragedy followed by another and assume a pattern is forming. You hear 3 friends mention the same book and think, this must be a sign. But randomness has no memory, no intention, no direction. And most of the time, what feels like a pattern is just your mind reaching for control in a world that often offers none. The clustering illusion isn't foolish, it's human. Your brain is built to seek connection, to find shapes in clouds, faces in shadows, stories in silence. But not every cluster is a clue. Not every repetition is a revelation. This trap can lead to magical thinking, to paranoia, to conspiracy, to deeply believing that something is being orchestrated just for you. And sometimes that belief soothes you, but other times it misguides you. Here's the shift. You're allowed to wonder, but don't worship every pattern just because it showed up more than once. Ask, is this pattern real, or am I just noticing what I want to see? Is this meaningful or just memorable? Because not every echo is prophecy. And sometimes what feels connected, level 56, Dunning-Kruger effect. You've just started learning something, and suddenly you feel like an expert. You skim an article, watch a video, have one good experience, and you think, I've got this figured out. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias where people with low ability or knowledge tend to overestimate their competence, while those with high ability often underestimate themselves. You know just enough to see how much you don't know. And that's the paradox. The more you know, the more aware you become of what you don't know. While the less you know, the more you assume you've learned everything there is to learn. This trap lives everywhere, in arguments where confidence beats accuracy, in workplaces where the loudest voice gets the seat, in social media where everyone becomes a coach, a guru, a guide. It shows up in you too, and feel like you've mastered it. You offer advice before understanding the depth. You speak with certainty before you've earned clarity. But true wisdom isn't loud. It's humble. It questions itself. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't mean you're unintelligent. It means you're human. Your mind craves certainty. It wants to arrive quickly. But growth takes humility. And real learning begins when you realize how far you still have to go. Here's the shift. Ask more than you answer. Learn longer than you teach. And when you feel absolutely sure, pause. Ask, what am I missing? Who knows more than me? What haven't I considered yet? Because wisdom isn't knowing everything, it's knowing that you don't. Level 57, Representativeness Heuristic. You see a quiet man reading a philosophy book and assume he's a professor, not a truck driver. You hear someone is emotional and spiritual and assume they're a poet, not a scientist. That's the representativeness heuristic. The mental shortcut where you judge how probable something is based on how closely it fits your mental image, not on actual odds. You ask, what does this remind me of? Instead of, what's most likely true? It's fast, efficient, intuitive, but it's often wrong because your brain doesn't check the math. It checks the pattern. You hear about someone who's creative, introverted, and loves metaphors and assume they're a novelist, even though they're statistically more likely to be a teacher. You assume a kind person can't be a criminal, You assume a powerful speaker must be a leader. You assume a tattooed stranger is less trustworthy than someone in a suit. This trap builds stereotypes. It fuels bias. When your gut is full of assumptions, it makes you miss the truth because you're too focused on the story that seems to fit. Here's the shift. Challenge the match. Don't just ask, does this seem right? Ask, how likely is this really? What am I basing this on? Is this pattern real or just familiar? Because truth doesn't always wear the clothes you expect, and reality doesn't owe you a stereotype. Level 58, illusory correlation. You see two things happen close together and assume one caused the other. You notice people behave a certain way and start linking it to their background, their looks, their habits, even when the link isn't real. That's the illusory correlation, the tendency to perceive a relationship between two things when no actual connection exists. You hear a few negative stories about a group and start to associate them with negativity. You eat something unusual and get sick later and forever avoid that food, even if it had nothing to do with it. You wear a certain shirt during a lucky moment, and suddenly it's your good luck charm. You link behaviors to outcomes, people to expectations, symbols to consequences, not because the pattern is true, but because the feeling becomes belief. This track shows up in racism, in superstition, in confirmation bias, in fake science, in the tiny ways you build stories about cause and effect without ever testing if they're actually connected. It feels like every time I see this, that happens. Those kinds of people always do this. This event always leads to that. But patterns can lie. Coincidence can repeat, and the truth doesn't always travel in pairs. Here's the shift. Be careful where you draw lines. Ask, have I tested this connection or just assumed it? Could this be random? Am I reacting to reality or just to repetition? Because believing in false connections doesn't make you wise, it just makes you stuck in stories that were never real to begin with. And clarity begins when you stop linking dots, just because they're near each other. Level 59, survivorship bias. You see the millionaire who dropped out of school and think dropping out must be a smart move. You see the startup that made it big and assume hustle always wins. You read success stories about those who broke the rules, beat the odds, and soared. And you think, if they did it, I can too. That's the survivorship bias, the tendency to focus on the people or things that succeeded and ignore those that are far more common. You hear the stories of those who made it. They're on the magazine covers, in the documentaries, on the podiums. But what about the hundreds who did the same thing and didn't make it? What about the businesses that failed? The artists who starved? The voices that never got heard? They're invisible. And that invisibility distorts reality. This trap makes you overestimate success and underestimate risk. It convinces you that persistence always pays off, that talent always rises, that your chances are higher because someone else got lucky. But for every story of survival, there are dozens of stories that never got told. Not because they weren't worthy, but because they didn't make it. And this doesn't mean you shouldn't try. It means you should try with your eyes open. Here's the shift. Instead of only asking, what did the winners do? Also ask, what did the losers do the same and still lose? What am I not seeing? What's missing from this highlight reel? Because true wisdom comes from learning from the fallen just as much as the celebrated. And success isn't just about doing what winners do. It's about understanding why so few become winners at all. Level 60. False cause fallacy. You took the vitamin and then felt better. You wore your lucky shirt and won the game. You had a bad thought and something bad happened. So you think, that must be why. That's the false cause fallacy, that because one thing happened after another, the first thing caused the second. Post hoc. Therefore, just because one event follows another doesn't mean it created it. You confuse order with influence, timing with truth. It shows up in everyday life. You try a new routine, and something good happens, so you stick with it like it's a spell. You see a new leader take office, and the economy dips. You avoid black cats, break mirrors, or change your route based on what happened last time, because now it feels connected. But life is full of moving parts, endless variables, invisible factors. The false cause fallacy reduces all that complexity to a single line, A then B. So A caused B. It creates false confidence, leads to poor decisions, and worst of all, it stops you from asking better questions. Here's the shift. Ask not just what happened, but why it really happened. What other variables were at play? Could this have happened without the first thing? Have I confused timing with truth? Because meaning must be earned, not assumed. And real wisdom isn't just finding connections. It's knowing when not to. If even one truth hit home, don't scroll. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Someone you love might need this more than you know. Level 61. Texas sharpshooter fallacy. You fire random shots at a wall, and then draw a bullseye right around the ones that landed closest together. You say, look, I hit the target. But really, you created the target after the fact. That's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. When you cherry-pick data to fit a narrative that you've already decided is true. You highlight the hits, ignore the misses. You build a case using only the moments that agree with you, while pretending the rest never happened. This trap lives in data science, in business pitches, in health trends, in personal reflection. You started a new diet and lost weight, but ignore the times you slept better, exercised more, or skipped meals. You predict something vague, and later, find a moment that matches, just enough to feel like a prophecy. You argue that your lucky number shows up often, but only count when it does, never when it doesn't. This fallacy is seductive because it feels like evidence. It looks like accuracy, but it's just storytelling, masquerading as truth. The target is an illusion. The story is shaped in reverse. Here's the shift. Don't just ask, what supports my view? Ask. Level 62, availability heuristic. You hear about a plane crash, and suddenly, flying feels terrifying. You watch the news talk about crime and assume the world is getting more dangerous. You remember one time you were embarrassed, and it feels like you're always messing up. That's the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge how likely or important something is based on how easily you can recall it. Not because it happens more, but because it's louder in your mind. Your brain confuses vividness with frequency. You don't hear about the thousands of flights that land safely every day, only the one that didn't. You don't think about the quiet kindness that surrounds you, only the one person who hurt you. You don't calculate the actual odds. You just remember the story. And the more dramatic, painful, or recent something is, the more it dominates your mental space. This trap warps your risk perception. It inflates fear. It distorts decision-making. It makes you overreact to rare dangers and underreact to quiet, consistent risks. It makes you live your life based on what's memorable. Here's the shift. Ask, is this common or just vivid? What don't I remember? Because it's too ordinary to stand out. Because your memory is not a mirror, it's a spotlight. And that spotlight doesn't always shine on what matters most. So learn to look beyond what's loud, beyond what's fresh, beyond what fear keeps replaying. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what happened. It's how often you think it did. Level 63, Halo Effect. They're attractive, so you assume they're kind. They're confident, so you believe they're capable. They made one great impression, and now everything about them feels better. That's the halo effect, the tendency to let a single positive trait overshadow everything else about a person, product, or idea. You meet someone who's eloquent and assume they must be wise. You see someone who's wealthy and assume they must be disciplined. You admire someone's creativity and assume they must be emotionally intelligent too. But brilliance in one area doesn't guarantee brilliance in others. This trap leads you to trust the wrong people, to ignore red flags because the glow is too strong, and it shows up everywhere. In relationships, you fall for the first spark and justify the pain that follows. In leadership, you vote for charisma, then suffer from incompetence. In branding, you trust a product because it feels premium. Even in how you see yourself, you succeed once and suddenly feel invincible. But no one is all good, no idea is flawless, no impression tells the full story. Here's the shift. Admire without idolizing. Appreciate without assuming. Pause and ask, what else is true about this person? What might I be ignoring because of one positive trait? It's just harder to see. And wisdom means noticing both the light and the shadow it casts. Level 64, Horn Effect. They made a bad first impression, so you assume they're selfish. They're awkward in conversation, so you assume they're unintelligent. They messed up once, and now that's all you see. That's the Horn Effect. The tendency to let one negative trait or single bad moment bleed into your entire perception of someone. One crack, and the whole mirror shatters. You see the frown and assume meanness. You hear the stumble and assume incompetence. You learn of a mistake and forget everything good they've ever done. And you do this quickly, automatically, emotionally, because it's easier to label someone than to hold complexity. Level 65, Anchoring Bias. You hear a price, $500. Then the next price, $300, feels cheap, even if it's not. You're told someone is difficult, and every interaction that follows gets tinted by that word. You see a number, a label, a rumor, and it becomes your anchor. That's the anchoring bias, the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information you receive when making decisions or forming judgments. Even if it's random, even if it's wrong, you're offered the salary. You negotiate from that number, not from your worth. You hear a statistic in the news. You compare everything else to it, even if the data has changed. You meet someone who reminds you of your past and assume they'll behave the same way. This trap is sticky, becomes the foundation, and everything that follows is measured against it. It doesn't matter how reasonable the new information is. The anchor pulls you back. This affects your spending, your relationships, your goals, your self-worth. You tell yourself, I used to weigh this much. I used to make this much. I should be here by now. And suddenly, you're judging the present against a ghost. Here's the shift. Challenge the anchor. Ask, where did this number come from? Why am I starting from here? Is this reference point still valid or just familiar? Because clarity doesn't come from comparing against the past. It comes from reevaluating the present. And freedom begins when you cut the rope that's still tied to the first thing you heard. Level 66, Status Quo Bias. You stick with the same routine even when it drains you. You defend the current system even when it no longer serves you. You say, this is just how things are. That's the status quo bias, the tendency to prefer things to stay the same, simply because they already are. It's not that the current way is better, it's just that it's known. It's safe, predictable, unchallenging. You stay in the relationship, the job, the belief, not because it's right, but because the idea of change feels overwhelming. This trap tells you at least you know what to expect, even if what you expect is burnout, loneliness, or regret. It whispers, don't rock the boat, even if you're sinking in it. It keeps systems in place, habits in motion, minds asleep. The status quo bias doesn't preserve peace. It preserves familiar pain. It makes you question the new more than the broken. It makes you say, it could be worse, instead of asking, could it be better? Here's the shift. Comfort isn't proof. Familiarity isn't truth. And just because something has always been this way, doesn't mean it should be. Ask, would I choose this again if I were starting fresh? Am I staying because I believe in it, or because I'm afraid of something else? Because sometimes the only thing standing between you and the life you want is the story you keep repeating about why you can't leave this one. Level 67, Optimism Bias. You think, it won't happen to me. You hear about failure, debt, heartbreak, illness, and believe somehow you'll be the exception. That's the optimism bias, the belief that you're more likely than others to experience positive outcomes and less likely to face the negative ones. It feels empowering, hopeful, motivating, but it can also make you reckless, unprepared, naive. You skip health insurance because you feel invincible. You ignore the warning signs in a relationship because you're different. You put off saving, building, repairing because the future will work itself out. You assume you'll beat the odds, outperform the norm, escape the fate that others fall into. And here's the irony. Sometimes that belief does help. Optimism fuels effort. Confidence breeds performance. Hope can be healing, but unchecked, it becomes a trap. You take risks without safety nets. You avoid hard conversations. You ignore problems until they become crises. You think you're immune until life proves you're not. This trap doesn't just blind you to risk. It blinds you to empathy. Because when you believe only others fall, you stop seeing how far anyone can fall, even you. Here's the shift. Don't kill the optimism. Just anchor it in reality. Ask, what would I do if I went the exception? What's the smart move, not just the hopeful one? Do I have a plan for if things don't go perfectly? Because true confidence isn't betting on perfection. It's being ready when things aren't. And hope becomes wisdom when it stands side by side with preparation. Level 68, Groupthink. You feel a knot in your gut, but you say nothing. Everyone else agrees, so you smile and nod. You silence your doubt to avoid standing out. That's groupthink, the tendency to conform to group opinions to maintain harmony, even when you sense something is wrong. You go along to get along. You tell yourself, if no one else is speaking up, I must be overthinking it. You trade your clarity for their comfort. This trap shows up in boardrooms, in friend groups, in families, in nations. It's when decisions are made, not because they're right, but because they're uncontested. You don't want to be the disruptor. You don't want to seem negative. You don't want to be the only voice saying, wait, are we sure? And so, danger hides beneath politeness. Bad ideas get traction. Good people stay silent. But silence isn't safety. It's complicity. And the longer you hold it, the harder it becomes to speak up. Groupthink kills innovation. It buries accountability. It creates environments where fear wears a friendly smile. Here's the shift. Courage doesn't mean being loud. It means being honest. Ask, am I agreeing because I believe or because I don't want to be alone? What's not being said here? What would I say if I wasn't afraid of their reaction? Because real harmony doesn't come from forced agreement. It comes from truth spoken gently and received with strength. Level 69, projection bias. You think, if it makes sense to me, it must make sense to them. You believe, if I would never do that, they probably wouldn't either. You feel something intensely and assume everyone else should feel it too. That's the projection bias, the tendency to assume that others think, feel, and act the way you do. You use your own emotions as the default for how others must be feeling. You assume someone's being rude because you'd never be that quiet unless you were mad. You plan a surprise based on what you would love to receive. You judge their reaction by imagining how you would have reacted. And in doing so, you stop seeing them and only see more of yourself. This trap distorts empathy in relationships. It makes you blind to difference, to nuance, to them. You expect your future self to want the same things your present self does. You assume your partner needs the same comfort you crave. You give advice that would work for you, but not for them. Projection bias turns compassion into assumption. It replaces listening with mirroring, and it leads to frustration. Because when people don't behave how you would, you take it personally. But here's the shift. You are not everyone, and no one else is you. Ask, what might they be feeling that I've never felt? What if their silence means something else? What would change if I stopped trying to see me in them and started trying to see them? Because empathy doesn't begin with imagining others are like you. It begins with the courage to imagine they're not. Level 70, cognitive dissonance. You believe in honesty, but you told a lie. You value health, but you skipped the gym again. You say relationships matter most, but you haven't called in weeks. And it hurts. That discomfort, that inner tension, that urge to explain it away, that's cognitive dissonance, the mental and emotional stress you feel when your actions don't align with your beliefs. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal. I had no choice. You rationalize. You edit your memory. You shift your beliefs just slightly, so the contradiction feels less painful. Because your brain craves harmony, coherence, a self-story that makes sense. It can't tolerate being both good and wrong. So it rewrites the truth just enough to stay whole. This trap shows up in relationships. When you stay in something toxic, but tell yourself it's not that bad. It shows up in politics, when you support someone and ignore the evidence that challenges your faith in them. It shows up in everyday moments, When your identity as a kind person clashes with your behavior, and instead of changing your actions, you change the justification. But the real danger is when this trap becomes chronic, when you ignore too many truths, when your self-image becomes so fragile that any contradiction feels like a threat. Here's the shift. Don't run from the tension. Use it. Let dissonance be a signal, not of failure, but of growth trying to happen. Ask, what belief am I trying to protect? What would I see if I stopped needing to feel right? What version of me am I afraid to outgrow? Because truth doesn't always fit neatly into who you thought you were. But letting go of false alignment is how you make space for something truer. Level 71, confirmation bias. You have a belief, a strong one, a favorite idea, a gut instinct, and now you're on a mission to prove it right. That's the confirmation bias. The tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what you already believe, and to ignore, forget, or discredit everything else. You Google your opinion and click the articles that agree. You remember the times you were right and dismiss the ones you weren't. You notice behavior in someone you distrust and miss the same behavior in someone you like. This trap is not just intellectual, it's emotional. Because your beliefs are not just ideas, they're part of your identity, and challenging them feels like self-betrayal. So your mind becomes a defense system, a filter, a fortress. You scroll through facts and only absorb the ones that validate you. You watch two people make the same mistake and only blame the one who disagrees with you. You don't find truth. You construct it, reinforce it, protect it. But here's the quiet tragedy. Confirmation bias doesn't just shield you from being wrong. It shields you from learning, from evolving, from seeing the world, not as it feels, but as it is. Here's the shift. Let go of the need to win every argument, even with yourself. Ask, what would I believe if I didn't already believe this? What's the strongest case against my view? What am I avoiding? Not because it's false, but because it's uncomfortable. Because growth doesn't happen by proving yourself right. It happens by risking the possibility that you've been wrong. And truth doesn't require loyalty, only courage. Level 72, procrastination bias. You tell yourself, I'll do it tomorrow. You feel the pressure rise, so you clean the house instead. You scroll, you snack, you start something else that feels productive, but isn't the thing you actually need to do. That's procrastination bias, the tendency to prioritize short-term comfort over long-term value. You know what matters, but your brain is wired to favor what feels good now, and discomfort, even small, feels like danger. The difficult conversation, the habit change, the creative risk, the uncomfortable truth. You tell yourself you'll be in a better mindset later, that you just need to feel more ready, more energized, more motivated. But later becomes a pattern, and motivation doesn't come, because motivation doesn't precede action. It follows it. This trap whispers, you have time, until you don't. It says, rest a little longer, until rest becomes avoidance. And it convinces you waiting is harmless, when really it's erosion of trust in yourself, of belief in your momentum, of the life you could have lived. Here's the shift. Stop waiting to feel ready. Start anyway, especially when it's uncomfortable. Don't aim for perfect. Aim for progress. Ask, what would I do if I weren't waiting to feel like it? What does my future self want me to start now? What am I really avoiding, the task or how it makes me feel? Because small steps today are the seeds of a life you don't have to escape from tomorrow. And the longer you delay your calling, the more it starts to sound like guilt. Level 73, attribution error. They're late, so you think they're irresponsible. You're late because traffic was bad. They forget something, you say they're careless. You forget because you were overwhelmed. That's the attribution error, also known as the fundamental attribution error, where you blame other people's behavior on their character, but explain your own by circumstance. You judge them as flawed. You judge yourself as human. It's an unconscious double standard, a mental shortcut, and it happens fast. You see someone cut you off and label them a jerk. You cut someone off and think, I didn't see them. You assume intentions in others, but give yourself the benefit of the doubt. And slowly, you stop seeing people. You only see labels. Selfish, lazy, inconsiderate. And with each label, your compassion shrinks. This trap shows up in relationships, in parenting, in every space where people misunderstand each other, and then feel justified in doing so. But what if you paused? What if you said, maybe they're having a hard day. Maybe they didn't mean to. Maybe I've done the same thing once too. Here's the shift. Don't assume their behavior tells the whole story. Ask, what would I believe if I knew the full context? What if this wasn't about who they are, but what they're going through? And remember, judging someone else's character based on one moment is like judging a book by a torn page. Because understanding doesn't mean excusing. It means seeing more fully. Level 74, scarcity bias. It's running out, so you want it more. Only 2 left in stock? Now it feels urgent. A deadline's approaching? Now it feels important. That's the scarcity bias, the tendency to place more value on things that appear limited, rare, or fleeting, even if they aren't better, just scarcer. You want the seat because it's almost taken. You chase the opportunity because it might disappear, but because it might be your last chance. Scarcity hijacks your decision-making. It bypasses logic. It triggers emotion. It says, this might never come again. This is your only shot. You can't afford to wait. But urgency is not the same as worth. And scarcity does not equal truth. Marketers know this. Manipulators know this. Even your own fear knows this. They whisper, act now. Don't miss out. Everyone else already has it. And suddenly, you forget to ask, do I even want this? You're pulled forward by fear of loss, not alignment with value. This trap shows up in relationships. You cling to people because you believe you'll never find better. It shows up in careers. You take jobs because opportunities like this don't come twice. Here's the shift. Slow down. Scarcity wants you to panic. Wisdom wants you to pause. Ask, would I still want this if it were always available? Is this valuable because it's rare, or just because I'm afraid to wait? Because peace never pressures, and what's truly for you doesn't vanish the moment you hesitate. Level 75, social comparison trap. You were proud of your progress until you saw their success. You liked your body until you saw their photo. You felt content until they announced another win. That's the social comparison trap, the tendency to evaluate your own worth, happiness, or success based on what you see in others. And these days, you're surrounded by mirrors. Photos filtered through performance, smiles shaped for validation, and quietly, constantly, you compare. Their career, their relationship, their beauty, their house, their happiness. You measure your behind the scenes against their perfectly lit moment, and you always come up short, because comparison isn't neutral, it's selective. You don't compare your values, you compare your visibility. You don't compare your growth, you compare your timeline. You don't compare your healing, you compare your performance of having it all together. And slowly, you forget who you are when you're not busy trying to catch up. But here's the quiet truth. There is no race, no scoreboard, no prize for arriving faster at a life you didn't even want. Their path is not your failure. Their light is not your shadow. Here's the shift. Unfollow who you need to. Mute the noise. Come back to yourself. Ask, would I still want this if I didn't see it online? Is this comparison helping me grow, or just making me feel small? What do I already have that I forget to celebrate because I was too busy looking sideways? Because joy shrinks when it's measured, and real fulfillment begins when your focus returns to what's yours. Level 76, Spotlight Effect. You stumble over your words and assume everyone noticed. You wear something different and feel eyes on you all day. You post something and replay it in your head like it's being dissected by a crowd. That's the spotlight effect, the tendency to believe you're being noticed, judged, and remembered far more than you actually are. It's like a spotlight follows you everywhere, highlighting every flaw, every misstep, every awkward pause. But here's the truth. Most people aren't watching. They're not judging. They're not even paying attention because they're stuck under their own spotlight. You're the center of your world, but everyone else, they're too busy starring in theirs. This trap makes you shrink. You avoid risk. You overthink your past. You edit yourself until what's left feels small and scripted. It steals your voice, your spontaneity, your joy, and worst of all, it convinces you that every mistake matters forever. But people forget. They forgive. They move on much faster than your memory does. Here's the shift. Step out of the imagined spotlight. Ask, am I judging myself through the lens of an audience that doesn't exist? Level 77, Fear of Success. You dream big, but slow down when it starts working. You get closer to the breakthrough, and suddenly self-sabotage. You want it, the goal, the growth, the new identity. But deep down, you're afraid of what will happen if it actually comes true. That's the fear of success. A psychological trap where the very idea of succeeding triggers anxiety, resistance, and retreat. Not because success is bad, but because success means change. Success means visibility. It means responsibility. It means no more hiding in the comfort of potential. It asks, who will you become when you rise? What if people expect more from you? What if the pressure is too much? So instead of leaping forward, you pause, you procrastinate. You undercut yourself before the world can. This trap hides behind perfectionism, behind delays, behind endless preparation. But at the root is fear. Fear that success will isolate you, that you'll outgrow the people you love, that you'll lose the right to rest, that you'll be seen, judged, and expected to never fall again. But here's the truth. Success doesn't erase your softness. It doesn't demand perfection. It just asks you to stop pretending you're not capable. Here's the shift. Ask, what am I afraid I'll lose if I win? What story am I telling myself about what success will take from me? Can I hold joy, power, and peace without guilt? Because fear of success is still fear. And every fear shrinks in the life you're building. You just have to believe you're allowed to have it. Level 78, Learned Helplessness. You've tried and failed. tried again, and failed again. So eventually, you stop trying altogether. Not because the door is locked, but because you've convinced yourself it's not worth reaching for the handle anymore. That's learned helplessness, a condition where repeated disappointments lead you to believe you are powerless, even in situations where you're not. You tell yourself, this is just how it is. No one cares. Nothing will ever change. You shrink your dreams. You mute your voice. You stay in the cage even when the door swings open. Because somewhere along the way, failure stopped being an event and started feeling like a sentence. You become emotionally exhausted. You stop trusting opportunity. You convince yourself that hope is naive and effort is foolish. This trap is subtle. It doesn't shout. It sighs. And the longer you stay in it, the more normal it begins to feel. But here's the painful truth. You've just been taught to feel like you are. Here's the shift. Instead of asking, what's the point? Try asking, what small thing can I try today, just to test if the world still moves? What if this time is different? What if I don't need to escape everything? Just the belief that I can't. Because helplessness can be learned, but so can hope. And the tiniest act of resistance, a step, a whisper, a question, can begin to unteach the lie. Level 79, hedonic adaptation. You got the promotion, the car, the relationship, the home, the thing you thought would finally make you feel enough. And for a moment, it did. But then the feeling faded. That's hedonic adaptation, a psychological phenomenon where you quickly return to a baseline level of happiness, no matter how good or bad something feels at first. You work for years to get there, then adapt within weeks. You think, if I just had this, I'd be happy. But once you do, you're already chasing the next thing. This trap is why achievement alone never satisfies. It's why we live in a world of more, yet still feel empty. Hedonic adaptation is not about being ungrateful. It's about being human. Your mind is wired to normalize, to adjust, to protect itself from extremes, even joy. But what protects you can also numb you. And soon, you stop noticing the beautiful. You stop celebrating what once felt impossible. You confuse absence of pain with absence of meaning. Here's the shift. Instead of asking, what's next? Start asking, what's here? Instead of chasing the high, return to the gratitude that gave it meaning. Ask, what did I once dream of that I now take for granted? What can I savor right now before it becomes just another background blur? Because happiness isn't a destination, it's a practice. And fulfillment doesn't come from adding more, but from remembering more deeply what you already have. Level 80, emotional reasoning. You feel anxious, so you assume something must be wrong. You feel like a failure, so you believe you are one. You feel unloved, so you conclude that no one truly cares. That's emotional reasoning, the cognitive trap where you mistake your feelings for facts. If I feel it, it must be real. But feelings are not evidence. They are signals. They're valid, but not always accurate. You can feel guilt without having done wrong. You can feel fear without being in danger. You can feel worthless and still be deeply needed. But when you're in this trap, your emotions become the courtroom, the judge, and the sentence. You say, I feel stupid, so I must be. I feel like this will never get better, so it won't. I feel alone, so no one cares. It becomes a self-fulfilling belief. Because once you decide it's true, you stop looking for proof to the contrary. You stop questioning. You start collapsing. This trap turns storms into certainties. It confuses intensity with importance. But emotions don't always point north. Sometimes they spin. Sometimes they lie. Here's the shift. Instead of asking, "What does this feeling prove?" ask, "What might this feeling be pointing to? What story am I telling myself based on how I feel? What else might be true that my emotion is hiding from me?" Because emotions are visitors, not verdicts. And feeling something deeply doesn't make it destiny. Level 81, appeal to authority. They said it, so it must be true. They have a title, a following, a degree. So you stop asking questions. You defer. You nod. You silence your doubt. That's the appeal to authority. The trap of accepting a claim as true just because someone with perceived power, status, or expertise said it. It feels efficient, safe, comforting, because responsibility dissolves when someone else is the expert. Authority is not equal truth, and power does not always mean wisdom. This trap shows up in media, in politics, in religion, in the workplace, in your own relationships. You follow the influencer's advice, not because it's logical, but because they seem certain. You agree with the executive, not because the idea is sound, but because of their position. You ignore your gut, your reasoning, your research, because they must know better. But even experts get it wrong. Even teachers can mislead. Even leaders can be lost. And blindly trusting authority is how critical thought dies. Here's the shift. Respect credentials, but interrogate claims. Ask, does what they're saying hold up on its own? Am I agreeing because of who said it or what they said? What questions would I ask if I weren't afraid to seem rebellious? Because truth doesn't need a title. And real authority isn't offended by questions. It invites them. Level 82, appeal to ignorance. No one has proven it wrong, so it must be right. No one has shown it's true, so it must be false. That's the appeal to ignorance, the belief that a lack of evidence for or against something is itself a reason to believe or dismiss it. And silence from the unknown doesn't always mean no. This trap plays tricks on logic. You hear, "No one can prove aliens don't exist, so they must." Or, "There's no evidence this treatment works, so it must be useless." Or, "If you can't show me the risk, then it must be safe." But the truth often lives in the unknown, in complexity, in waiting. This bias doesn't just infect debate, it infects belief. It gives false confidence. It builds arguments on gaps. It shows up in your inner world, too. You say, "No one has told me I'm doing well, so I must be failing." Or, "They haven't said they're upset, so everything must be fine." But silence is not truth, and mystery is not permission to decide what fits your fear. Here's the shift. When you face the unknown, resist the urge to fill it too quickly. Ask, am I trying to replace uncertainty with assumption? Is this belief based on what I know or what I don't? What would happen if I just let the unknown remain unknown for now? Because wisdom doesn't rush into answers. It makes peace with the space between them. It makes peace. Level 83, false dichotomy. You're either successful or a failure, right or wrong, with us or against us. That's the false dichotomy. The belief that there are only two options, when in reality, there are many. It's black or white, this or that, yes or no. But the world lives in the gray. It creates artificial tension. It turns questions into ultimatums. You either support this, or you're part of the problem. You're either confident, or you're insecure. You win, or you're worthless. And in that framing, you feel forced to choose between extremes that don't reflect who you really are. This trap shows up in arguments, in politics, in your inner voice. It makes you say things like, if I'm not perfect, I failed. If I can't fix this now, I'll never fix it. If I can't be strong, I must be weak. But life is rarely either or. It's usually and. You can be unsure and wise. Struggling and growing, wrong and still worthy of love. Here's the shift. When you feel cornered, step back. Ask, what am I being told the only two options are? What else could be true at the same time? Is this an honest choice or just a narrow lens? Because the most dangerous trap is not being forced to choose, but believing the choice was real in the first place. And freedom begins when you see that the space between two extremes is often where your truth lives. Level 84, overgeneralization. You failed once, so you think you always will. You were rejected, so you assume no one ever wants you. You feel lost today, so you believe your whole life is off track. That's overgeneralization, the mental trap where one event, feeling, or mistake gets stretched into a broad, all-encompassing conclusion. Words like always, never, everyone, everything start to dominate your self-talk. I always mess things up. I never do anything right. Everyone else is ahead of me. Everything I try fails. But those statements aren't facts, they're emotional echoes. This trap builds walls around your identity. It takes temporary pain and welds it into permanence. And the more you repeat it, the more you believe it, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Overgeneralization isn't just a thought pattern. It's a form of quiet self-punishment. You rob yourself of nuance. You flatten your complexity. You make your future a prisoner of your past. And it shows up in how you see others, too. They hurt you once, so they're toxic. They disagreed with you, so they're always like that. They let you down, so they'll never change. But no one is always anything, including you. Here's the shift. Instead of saying always, ask, when did this happen? Exactly. Instead of saying never, ask, what moments contradict that belief? Instead of saying everyone, ask, am I talking about a few loud voices or the truth? Because you are not your worst day. You are not your sharpest pain. You are not a sentence. You're a story. And the next chapter begins the moment you stop believing that one page defined the whole book. Level 85. The just world fallacy. You hear someone is suffering, and a voice in your mind says, they must have done something wrong. You see someone succeed and think, they must have earned it. That's a just world fallacy. The belief that the world is fundamentally fair. That good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. Because the idea of a random, unjust world is too painful to hold. So your mind creates a moral shortcut. They got what they deserved. This trap feels safe. It makes life predictable. It gives you the illusion of control. If I just do everything right, bad things won't happen to me. If someone's struggling, there must be a reason. But life is more complicated than karma. And pain is not always punishment. People suffer who did nothing wrong. People rise who stepped on others to get there. Injustice happens. Loudly, quietly, constantly. This fallacy doesn't just distort your view of the world. It distorts your empathy. You see someone fail, And instead of compassion, you feel distance. You say, they should have worked harder. They must have made bad choices. They probably deserved it. But what if they didn't? What if they're you on a different day? Here's the shift. Trade judgment for gentleness. Trade certainty for curiosity. Ask, am I looking for reasons to feel safe? Or for ways to understand? When I stop needing the world to be fair, because justice is something we create, not something the world always gives. And real maturity begins when you stop needing life to feel fair in order to care. If even one truth hit home, don't scroll. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Someone you love might need this more than you know. Level 86, loss aversion. You hesitate to invest, to move, to speak, to leave. Not because you don't want more, but because you're afraid to lose what you already have. That's loss aversion, the psychological tendency to fear losses twice as much as we value equivalent gains. Winning $100 feels good, but losing $100, it hurts. This trap makes you hold tight to the familiar, to the outdated, to the underwhelming, because at least it's mine. Don't risk it. Don't let go. Don't trade something sure for something uncertain. And so, you stay in relationships that don't nourish you, jobs that drain you, cities that shrink you, beliefs that don't serve you, because the cost of leaving feels heavier than the benefit of starting fresh. Loss aversion makes you see risk where there is only possibility. It turns dreams into danger and turns you into your own gatekeeper. Here's the shift. When you feel the fear of loss, pause. Ask, what exactly am I afraid to lose? What might I gain that's even greater? Is this comfort or quiet fear in disguise? Because growth often requires release, and peace doesn't always come from what you keep, but from what you're willing. Level 87, the sunk cost fallacy, revisited. You've spent years in this relationship, thousands of hours in this job, so much energy chasing this goal, and now you're exhausted, unfulfilled, maybe even unhappy, but you stay because of everything you've already given. That's the sunk cost fallacy, the irrational pull to continue investing in something that's no longer serving you, simply because you've already invested so much. You say, I can't walk away now. Look how far I've come. What's gone is gone. The time, the money, the effort, you can't get it back. So the real question isn't, what have I already spent? It's, what will it cost me to keep going? This trap shows up in careers, in degrees you no longer care about, in relationships that no longer grow, in projects you've outgrown but feel obligated to finish. It traps you in momentum, not meaning, in commitment, not clarity. You stay, not because it's right, but because quitting feels like losing. But walking away from what's wrong isn't losing. It's winning your life back. Here's the shift. Ask, if I hadn't already invested so much, would I still choose this today? Am I honoring the past or clinging to it? What would I do if I believed I still had the right to change my mind? Because your past effort is not your prison. And letting go doesn't waste your story. It redeems it. Level 88. The illusion of control. You triple-check the lock. Rehearse the conversation. Make backup plans for your backup plans. You try to say everything just right. Do everything just right. Be everything just right. Because deep down, you believe that if you do all of this, you'll stay safe. That's the illusion of control. The false belief that you can control outcomes that are actually unpredictable, random, or completely out of your hands. You think, if I plan enough, worry enough, prepare enough, maybe nothing bad will happen. And when something does go wrong, you blame yourself because you believed you had power over it. This trap is a coping mechanism. It gives you a sense of order in a chaotic world. It makes you feel like if you're just careful enough, you can bend fate. But not everything is yours to hold. You can't control how people respond. You can't guarantee outcomes. You can't script every step. And that's terrifying until you realize you don't have to, because control is exhausting, but trust is liberating. Here's the shift. Ask, what am I trying to control right now that isn't mine to manage? What would it feel like to release this outcome and return to presence? What if safety isn't in control, but in resilience? Because peace isn't the absence of chaos. Level 89, the availability cascade. You've heard it so many times. It must be true. It's everywhere. On your feed, in conversations, repeated by people you trust. So you stop questioning. You start believing. That's the availability cascade. A self-reinforcing cycle where an idea gains credibility simply because it's repeated over and over. It doesn't need facts. It just needs volume. And soon, familiarity becomes proof. This trap is the engine behind misinformation, behind stereotypes, behind viral fear, behind public panic. You hear a statistic again and again, so you stop checking the source. You see the same meme 20 times, so you assume it must be based on something real. You hear that everyone feels this way, so you start feeling that way too. The cascade begins with a whisper, grows into a wave, and ends in belief. Not because it was tested, but because it was echoed. This trap bypasses your logic by overwhelming your memory. You remember what you've heard the most, not what's most accurate. And over time, your beliefs can become the product of exposure, not examination. Here's the shift. Pause before you accept what feels familiar. Ask, have I actually questioned this? Or just heard it a lot? Is this true? Or just loud? What evidence supports this beyond the repetition? Because repetition is not reality, and truth isn't democratic. It doesn't get stronger just because more people are shouting it. Level 90, the Dunning-Kruger spiral, revisited. You barely understand the topic, but you speak with total certainty. Others hear your confidence and assume you must know what you're talking about. They agree, they echo, they elevate your voice, and suddenly, you're leading a crowd. That's the Dunning-Kruger spiral, when limited knowledge leads to inflated confidence, and that confidence draws attention, which reinforces the illusion of expertise. You don't just believe you're right. You gather others who believe it too. And now the spiral spins. It's not just ignorance. It's organized ignorance. This trap grows in groups, in social media threads, in loud communities with shallow understanding, in movements built on bravado instead of depth. You quote simplified truths. You reject nuance. You become allergic to uncertainty. And when someone with real knowledge enters the room, they're too cautious, too questioning, too humble to be believed. So the confident prevail, not because they're correct, but because they're louder. The Dunning-Kruger spiral is dangerous because it doesn't just fool you, it fools others. And eventually, it creates systems built on sand. Here's the shift. Ask, what do I not know? Who is quietly informed, but drowned out by louder voices? Am I following confidence or competence? Because real wisdom walks softly. It doubts itself. It invites correction. And the strongest minds are not the ones most certain, but the ones still listening. Level 91, the framing trap. Expanded. You hear, this treatment has a 90% success rate. You feel hope. You hear, this treatment has a 10% failure rate. You feel fear. Same truth, different emotion. That's the framing trap. The tendency to be influenced not by what is being said, but by how it's presented. It's not about lying, it's about the angle. You see a glass half full. You feel lack. This trap shapes your decisions without you realizing it. It shows up in marketing. Save $200 feels better than spend $800. In politics, pro-choice versus illegal, undocumented versus public funding cuts. In your personal life, you failed once, so you call yourself a failure, but you could have called it an attempt. You frame yourself, and those frames become stories. Stories become identities. Identities become prisons. This trap is subtle, because language feels harmless, but words create worlds. Here's the shift. When you hear something, especially when it provokes emotion, pause, ask, how else could this be worded? What is this framing trying to make me feel? Would I still think the same if the same truth were told differently? Because once you see the frame, you can look through it and decide for yourself. And sometimes, freedom begins not by changing the story, but by changing the words we use to tell it. Level 92, the authority bias revisited. You feel something's wrong, but an expert says it's fine, so you stay quiet. You have a question, but someone in charge speaks with certainty, so you second-guess yourself. That's the authority bias revisited. The tendency not only to overvalue the opinions of authority figures, but to undervalue your own voice in their presence. You defer, you shrink, you start to believe that expertise equals infallibility. This trap shows up in doctors' offices, in classrooms, in companies where someone always seems to know better. You say, they must be right. I'm probably overreacting. Who am I to question them? But credentials aren't immunity. Status doesn't equal insight. And knowledge without humility is just performance. This trap doesn't just distort truth. It damages trust in yourself. You stop listening to your instincts. You stop asking the questions that matter. You stop noticing the red flags you've already seen. And soon, you stop showing up as someone who deserves to be heard. But here's the shift. Respect authority, but don't silence yourself. Ask, what would I say if I believed my perspective mattered? What would change if I treated my intuition like a source of wisdom, not a glitch? Because even the most qualified voice doesn't know your life better than you do. And true authority doesn't silence your voice. It invites it. Level 93, the belief perseverance trap. You've held this belief for years. It shaped your choices, defined your worldview, gave you comfort, maybe even gave you belonging. Then you're shown clear, undeniable evidence. It's wrong. But instead of letting go, you double down. That's the belief perseverance trap, the tendency to cling to beliefs even after they've been proven false. Because in that moment, it's not just a belief being challenged, it's you. Letting go of the belief feels like letting go of your identity, your tribe, your past self. So you rationalize, you cherry-pick new evidence, you discredit the source, you bend the facts instead of breaking your attachment. This trap shows up in politics, in religion, in diet culture, in deeply personal narratives. You believe you're unlovable, someone loves you. You say, they must be mistaken. You believe the world is against you. Someone offers help. You say they must want something. You believe you're right. You find proof you're not. You say they must be doing something. Here's the shift. Instead of asking, how do I defend this? Ask, what would it cost me to admit I was wrong? Can I update my story without erasing who I've been? Because growth doesn't mean betraying your past. It means honoring it enough to evolve beyond it. And strength, level 94, the planning fallacy. You say, this won't take long. You start a project with energy, confidence, and a clear timeline. But somehow, you run out of time. Again. That's the planning fallacy. The tendency to consistently underestimate how long a task will take, how much effort it will require, and how many obstacles will appear along the way. You're not lazy. You're not clueless. You're just human. Your brain loves the ideal version of the plan. The clean calendar, the fresh to-do list, the you that never gets distracted, tired, discouraged, or interrupted. But real life isn't ideal. And the future you plan for often forgets the present you who will have to live it. You say yes to deadlines that feel generous, but weren't. You map out goals without building in rest, without margin, without the unexpected. This trap costs you more than time. It costs you trust in yourself. It turns passion into pressure. It turns progress into disappointment. Here's the shift. Be realistic and kind. Ask, how long did this take last time? What usually goes wrong? Can I plan for that? What would this timeline look like if I gave myself grace instead of guilt? Because wise planning isn't about perfection. It's about preparing for the human moments too. And success doesn't come from racing against the clock, but from working with it. Level 95, reactivity trap. You get a text that stings and reply instantly. You feel insulted and raise your voice. You feel urgency, so you decide now, without pause, without perspective. That's the reactivity trap, the tendency to react immediately and emotionally, instead of responding intentionally and thoughtfully. You confuse speed with strength, instinct with wisdom, impulse with intuition. And in the rush, you lose your center. This trap lives in your nervous system, in your breath, in your clenched fists and flushed cheeks. It's primal. Fight, flee, fix, fast. But the thing you do in those first few seconds is often not the thing you needed to do. You've seen the message, then wish you hadn't. You say the words, then feel the shame. You make the choice, then question if it was really yours. Reactivity robs you of agency. It feels like control, but it's actually surrendering your power to a moment. Here's the shift. Make space. Before you speak, breathe. Before you act, pause. Before you decide, feel all the way through. Ask, am I reacting to protect myself or responding to guide myself? What would I do if I had 10 more seconds to choose? Because silence isn't weakness. Stillness isn't indecision. And your greatest power is not in your first reaction, but in your second thought. Level 96, nostalgia trap. You remember how things used to be. Simpler, brighter, better. You replay old songs, old moments, old versions of you, and feel a soft ache you can't explain. That's the nostalgia trap, the tendency to idealize the past, while overlooking its pain and simultaneously discounting the beauty that still exists in the present. It whispers, remember when things made sense? Remember who you used to be? And slowly, you begin to believe that your best days are behind you. But nostalgia is selective. It's a filter. It smooths the rough edges, softens the grief, and turns ordinary days into glowing myths. You forget the loneliness, the fear, the doubt you carried even back then, and you miss what's in front of you because you're too busy mourning what never truly existed the way you remember it. This trap can lead to regret, to disconnection, to a feeling that life is somehow off track, when really, you're just comparing it to an illusion. Here's the shift. Honor the past, but don't live there. Ask, what am I remembering? And what am I conveniently forgetting? What does my present have that I would miss if I lost it tomorrow? What would happen if I gave today the same tenderness I give to my memories? Because beauty isn't just behind you. It's happening now, if you choose to see it. And sometimes, the life you long for. Level 97. The self-fulfilling prophecy trap. You think, A won't like me, so you hold back. You avoid eye contact. You keep your guard up. And keep theirs too. You think, I always fail, so you hesitate. You sabotage. You expect to lose, and slowly ensure it. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy trap. The phenomenon where your expectations influence your behavior in ways that bring those expectations to life. What you believe becomes what you signal. What you expect becomes what you attract. What you fear becomes what you help shape. This trap is invisible because it feels like observation, but it's participation. You say, I knew it, but you don't see how your own energy wrote the ending. You expect coldness, so you stop being warm. You expect rejection, so you never fully show up, just in case. This trap doesn't just shape your world, it shrinks it. And the longer you live through that lens, the more you believe it's the only truth. Here's the shift. Ask, what am I preparing for with my actions? The worst or the best? Is my belief based on evidence or just old wounds? Because your beliefs are not just passengers. They're architects. And every thought is a seed that either builds a cage or opens a door. Level 98, the control-reward loop. You prove your point and feel powerful. You anticipate the worst, and when it happens, you say, I knew it. You win the argument, but lose the connection. And still something in you feels satisfied. That's the control-reward loop, a mental trap where your brain becomes addicted to being in control, to being correct, to being one step ahead, even when it costs you your joy, your growth, or your relationships. Because being right feels safe. Being in control feels smart. Being prepared for the worst feels like strength. So your brain rewards those moments with dopamine, with pride, with the illusion of power. And soon you start chasing that feeling. You become hypervigilant, critical, rigid, stuck in cycles of I told you so, stuck in protecting a worldview you don't even like anymore, but feel addicted to defending. You control everything you can because it distracts you from what you can't. You try to control people so they won't surprise or disappoint you. You try to control outcomes so you never have to face uncertainty. And it works until it doesn't, because certainty without openness is a cage, and control without trust is just fear in disguise. Here's the shift. Ask, what do I keep trying to be right about instead of being real about? What would it cost me to let go of being in control and let myself be in connection instead? What if being wrong wasn't a weakness, but an invitation to evolve? Because the reward your brain really needs is not control. It's peace, it's truth, it's freedom. Level 99, the identity fixation trap. You've always been the responsible one, so you never let yourself fall apart. You've always been the funny one, so you laugh, even when you're hurting. You've always been the strong one, so you hide your weakness, even from yourself. That's the identity fixation trap. The tendency to over-identify with a label, role, or self-image to the point that you resist change, even when change would heal you. You become loyal to who you've always been, even if that version of you no longer fits. And when growth knocks at your door, you hesitate. Because if you let go of this identity, who will you be? This trap isn't just about ego, familiarity, the comfort of knowing your lines in the play. But growth is messy, healing is contradictory, and transformation requires stepping out of costume. You might have once needed to be the tough one, the fixer, the invisible, the protector, the rebel. But roles can expire, and identities can evolve. You don't owe your past self your entire future. Here's the shift. Ask, who am I trying to be, even if it no longer serves me? What would happen if I let myself become someone new? What identities do I wear for approval, survival, or habit, not truth? Because your soul isn't a label, and who you were is only one chapter of who you're becoming. Level 100, the resistance to being fully alive. You go through the motions, you meet expectations, you check the boxes, you survive each day, but deep down, you know something's missing. You laugh, but it doesn't reach your chest. You cry, but only when you're alone. You dream, but always just out of reach. That's the resistance to being fully alive, out of fear of being too much, not enough, or seen too clearly. You numb what hurts, but also what could heal. You protect yourself from disappointment, but also from wonder. You avoid pain and miss joy by the same distance. You become a version of yourself that's almost true, but filtered, watered down, safer. You don't speak your truth. You don't risk your art. You don't fully love. You don't fully feel. Because to be fully alive means to lose control, to be vulnerable, to be lit up with uncertainty. And yet, that's where life is waiting. Not in the comfort zone, but just beyond it. Here's the shift. Let life in, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. Ask, what would I do if I weren't afraid to feel it all? But ready never comes. What part of me have I been keeping small, just to stay safe? Because being alive isn't about perfection. It's about presence. Not about knowing, but about being here. And the most dangerous trap is not failure, or fear, or even pain. It's reaching the end of your life, having never fully stepped into it. If even one truth hit home, don't scroll. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Someone you love might need this more than you know.